Second round of book discussion. The first, as some of you were there, participated in it, happened immediately after the notes were put together and before the book came out. Now that the book is released for almost more than 2 months, we have assembled once more for a new round of discussion. So I hand it over to Anand, who would be moderating this session, organized together by Prabuddha Collective, University at the Margins, and Navayana. So, yes, Anand, yeah, we can start.
Thank you, Vaibhav. Thank you, everyone who is here. Initially, when Vaibhav suggested that I moderate this session, I was a bit diffident. I didn't reply for it. I was thinking about it, like one has to think about these things. So, am I the right fit? Should the publisher be doing the honors in this case at all? But then I accepted because I thought it's a chance for me to revisit this conversation with Shomo, at least I, as the publisher and as a reader of Ambedkar, has been having since August 2012. So I jotted down certain things. Since this morning, I've been thinking about what I've got to speak today. Then I thought, let me just put it down on paper, because I was also thinking about this thinking. So for me, I know Shomo as someone with a capacity to first receive the Ambedkarite wound and then pass it on as an arrow towards others. And my first encounter with him happened when I heard him present a paper, Ambedkar contra Aristotle, in August 2012 in the Teen Murti. And I wrote to him immediately. I met him there and he told me to get in touch with him on email. And I said, it was really wonderful to listen to your paper at Teen Murti. Fresh, insightful, and lucid. I also like the way you unpacked your ideas without actually reading from a paper. And I was thinking you would make such a wonderful teacher in a classroom. I had never heard Shomo talk before. This is the first encounter. A pity our paths did not cross before. I mean, I meant back then that I was not a student. Then I realized I've become a student over these years, and since the day I heard him at Nehru Memorial. So it's a strange relationship I have as an editor, publisher, then first as a somebody who was an attentive, hopefully attentive student. Then I told him, are you able to hear me clearly? Am I going too fast?
Yeah, I can hear you, but like your voice is echoing now.
Yeah, now I could hear my own echo. I don't know why. So I'm trying to figure out. I could hear myself. Is this better now?
It's not there anymore.
It's not there. Yeah, it came and it went. So am I clear otherwise, coming across to all of you?
Yes.
Okay. So I asked him for a working draft of his paper so I may read it, and I said I admit that my reading of Aristotle is totally rusty. I had read Aristotle's Poetics and Politics when I was probably 18 or 19 in my BA first year. And I also told him that I was hoping to convince him to put together more ideas on Ambedkar and maybe publish a book with Navayana. And he immediately got back to me and told me about his vision problem and that he would be in touch via phone, and then we met. And that journey led to Ambedkar and Other Immortals, eventually, that conversation. But I was thinking of how do you bridge this thing between what Shomo speaks and what it comes together in the final form of a material book. And I felt that even when Shomo talks, like those Ambedkar and Marx lectures and several I've heard, it's as if there is no stopping. And yet it is, his speech is always in the condition of listening. So I'll recall one anecdote from a friend in Kolkata who will remain unnamed. He's not with us right now here in this meeting. Shomo was to deliver a keynote in a conference, a two-day conference, and he did that in the morning. And then this friend recounted how he stayed till the very evening, till the very last paper, heard everyone, responded, interacted. So what was happening? So it was also an act of listening, and this is not an act of just a gestural one. It is equally about trying to listen to those thoughts as much as listening to one's own thoughts about thinking about that. So for me, Shomo is an original in so much as he listens to all of us, not casually, but attentively. What he may learn from every interaction through language and bodies from which speech emerges as text. And then he offers us a distilled version of the common of thought, the very equality bestowed upon all of us in the very act of thinking. Shomo's speaking, writing are then but acts of thoughtful listening. And they always revel in improvisational rigor, something that I was pleased with myself when I thought of that phrase. I'm sure it owes to misreading Shomo here and there. So for me, it's about speech and text and the text of speech, and combined with the Shomo's theater background and sometimes the thoughts I think about how he also makes comments about, his own blindness, and how that, because when he sometimes interacts with us and talks about an edit we have done, a suggestion we have done, he'll be able to recount the exact phrase of what he said and make us go back. Literally, we do what is called in editing track changes, and we literally go back on our tracks and sometimes improve a thought. And why do I say this? I think it's better said by Shomo himself and Ambedkar and other immortals. It describes the book as having started with mute wonder at the sudden illumination of the master's words in a somewhat dimly lit library in Delhi. This is with reference to Dr. Ambedkar. It ends with a series of rather brusque public provocations by way of introduction. In between lies stutterings in my own voice, and my voice is composed of other tongues. He has a nice footnote there, which I would ask you to go back to, like I did go back to the book today. And then he says, much of the clamor to follow and all of the aphasia can be traced back to this voice. And my voice is citation, only citation. Of what? Of words, of light, and their respective darkening. So Alex and I were editing his new book, Book of Utterances. Now it's come to distances. At one point, this was in the first 2 days that I went along with Alex to discuss the edits. And then I left Alex with Shomo to make matters happen faster. At one point, Shomo said, oh, he told Alex, he thought Alex was, we were rereading a sentence, which was recast or so we thought. Oh, you wrote that, he asked of Alex. It's so beautiful. Then I intervened and said, no, Shomo, you did. Oh, I wrote it so well. So where does this fabric of a book happen? And sometimes it would be the exact opposite. He would go back and say, these are my exact words, put them back in. And Soumick will speak next. First was gave a nice poetic description to the book. He called it a book of utterances that express, reveal, unconceal the tension between oppositions. And today I found myself tracing something called the Bahya Sutta, which the Buddha speaks to bark cloth wearing. Bahya is literally the one clad in bark cloth. And he is a layperson who is a seafarer who loses everything and then gets to be clad in just bark cloth. That's all he has. But he thinks he has attained some kind of enlightenment, but everybody tells him to go see the Buddha. He pesters him for the Dhamma. And then there is something that happens towards the end called, there is a Bahya Sutta, which Udana speaks. Now, and then I later discovered, I didn't know about this text. I'd heard of it, I had not read it. Something called the Udana Varga, which is an early Buddhist collection of topically organized chapters of aphoristic verses, or the word Udana is literally utterances attributed to the Buddha and his disciples. It's not just the Buddha. So there are many people who are speaking there. The title might be translated as Inspired Utterances. Now, what are the chances? Here I'm thinking about this book of utterances and then I find another echo. Oh, am I suggesting something completely irreverential? Maybe I am. So for me, it's about what Shomo enables is to, is a kind of a thinking as being. What is an event in thought? And how does Mahad or Shaheen Bagh constitute that immortal moment? How do we all become equal to the task of thinking equality as equals. So now I'm going to stop here. I was probably not expected to even say this much as a moderator. So thank you, Shomo, for over 8 years of conversations. And I've always found myself more kind of sharpened, awakened when I come and sit with you. And that's why we did these little videos, some of you might have seen, shared on Instagram and other forums. It was just that we were going and meeting Alex and I to give him copies of the book, and I decided whatever Shomo says, let's just record. It'll be nice. We'll ask him some slightly prepared questions as to we wanted to talk about the vaccine, and that's how that conversation happened. He was making chai and talking. So for me, there's nothing like a moment which is thoughtless when you're with Shomo. And it is a privilege and an honor to be mediating one form of your voice, which is the book, and which we are celebrating, which we are talking about, which we are discussing today. So I'll hand it over to Soumick, and then we will go in an alphabetical first name order with other discussants. And we will stick to the time that was discussed on email, more or less. I'll keep time since I'm the moderator. So thank you everyone again, and I'll hand it over to Soumick then.
Thank you, Anand, and let me just say it's an absolute pleasure. Am I audible? I'm clearly audible. Okay. So yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and it's a delight that the book is out, and I must congratulate Shomo again, because I did congratulate him when we were discussing the book previously. But now that in its physical form it is published, so this is a official congratulations, I guess. But also the fact that we are all of us are here discussing about the book finally, which we had been planning, Vaibhav had been planning for a long time, since the very beginning when he was helping Shomo with the book, and all of the other people who have been associated with the book quite extensively. So thank you again. So I will, what I'll do is I had written a longer review of the book before it was published actually. So I will not go back to that exactly, because that's a longish review and will take a lot of time. I'll try to be brief. I say max around 20-25 minutes, if that is okay. And so today what I'll try to do is talk about a particular problem that the book, that I felt when I reread the book again, parts of the book again, I felt we could relate to in our current situation. So this new this part, the talk is what I'm going to say is it's titled, I have given it a title, which is a contemporary plea for comparative passion, or how to exit the double bind of historical naturalism. This is more or less broadly the theme around which I'll talk. So today what I'll try to do is talk briefly about one problem among several others which the book analyzes, trying to develop it a bit here. What I'm calling problem here, I have called utterances previously. I had tried to distinguish previously between two types of these utterances, expressive and non-expressive, which we find in the book. I can't exactly explain this here, but at the risk of blunt reduction, let me just say, expressive utterances are normative utterances, that is, expressions of law, while non-expressive utterances are pure expressions of desire. Law is to be understood here beyond actual rules and regulations, even beyond jurisprudence, as, and I underline this, as an operation of naming. In that sense, it is something akin to language, that is, law is akin to language, which provides us with names and meanings. Law is not simply that which decides what is allowed and what is not allowed. Law, or the principle of law to be precise, is always that it names, so that it can separate the normal from the abnormal, the correct from the incorrect, the citizen from the criminal, the healthy from the sick, the contagious from the immune. These are all problems of law, but also problems of nomination. So law is the domain of necessity. It is necessary. It provides meaning. It helps us identify. Again, what is understood by naming here, and this is a very profoundly philosophical problem, the problem of naming, but I'll just put it in one line, that naming is a relation between an object and the world, between reality, real practices, and language or discourse or knowledge, whatever you might call. So that is the question of law and naming. So what is the other part? What do we understand by desire then? Desire is the search for that which cannot be named, which is beyond knowledge. Desire is the craving for that which cannot be named, such that the true object of desire is not offered to knowledge. For example, say in the medieval philosopher, theologian Augustine, love has the structure of desire, which makes caritas or divine love the impossible desire for God, whose knowledge is not available. So the true object of desire in the final analysis is a monstrosity, a certain other, which always escapes signification or naming. In Soumyabrata Choudhury's book, there are a set of utterances which express a relation between that which can be named and that which resists naming, which is unnameable. Or in other words, between law and desire. What we are calling expressive utterances is the unconcealment of this dialectic between law and desire. This is the first point. And the second point is that while non-expressive utterances, the other kind of utterances that we find in the book, are utterances which are monstrous utterances of pure desire, which are somehow made possible by the one who utters them in the wake of some ruptural experience. Some call it evental. All of that we need not go in here. Maybe, so maybe we can take this problem up later on about this expressive, non-expressive. I'm not going to talk about it in detail here. For the time being, let me just take up one such expressive utterance from the book, which goes by the name of social stupidity. The third chapter of the book is titled Coronavirus Notes Towards a Critique of Social Stupidity. So what do we understand by the problem of social stupidity? Choudhury explains this at length in the last section of that chapter. Social stupidity is a paradoxical statement. It is inertia of thought, which is also an acceleration of thought, meaning that it is both the passive moment of thinking as also the active moment of thinking, meaning that I'll come to that meaning later on, but let me just give you a background. The concept comes from Nietzsche, who Choudhury takes as his point of departure. But behind the concept of social stupidity, there lies the terms of a single relationship. A relationship which this book takes up many times in many ways. It is the relation between history and nature. I will more or less confine myself in examining this relation as it unfolds in the book and try to draw out some of its consequences as I understand it. So, now the concept of stupidity has a broad range of implication in Nietzsche, which touches upon many domains of knowledge, including the social, political, aesthetic, even pedagogy. Nietzsche talks about stupidity in many of his texts. However, in all of these cases, one thing remains constant. Stupidity is a mode of thinking which produces meaning. So, for example, in an essay titled On the Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, in a book called The Untimely Meditation by Nietzsche, Nietzsche talks about stupidity as a mode of historical consciousness. He defines it, but what kind of historical consciousness? That is the point. Nietzsche defines it as a utilitarian mode of thinking, which ascribes meaning to our past. It is a form of instrumental reason, which monumentalizes history. He calls this, and I quote Nietzsche here, blind power of the factual, or the tyranny of the actual. The function of assigning such meaning to history is political. It produces political obedience or acceptance of the state. Nietzsche defines it by the phrase, and I quote, this is within quote, thus it is. So stupidity is that which produces meaning, assigning value to history, and it creates political conformism. It does this by fetishizing facts or factuality, which creates a blind force. In Nietzsche's own term, we can call it a reactive force, which is based upon the accumulation of facts at high speed. Paradoxically, such a process produces reflective inertia, that is passivity of thinking. Nietzsche calls this, and I quote, labor of the greatest possible common utility. This is because such mode of thinking cannot unveil anything, cannot produce critique, because it continuously repeats the same utilitarian function. Nietzsche understands it as a civilizational disease, a civilizational malaise, or a historical disease. However, what is interesting about this mode of thinking is that, and here it becomes a bit complicated but fascinating, which we find in Choudhury's book, is that this mode of thinking is what is interesting about this mode of thinking is that by assigning meaning to history, it separates history from nature. As Choudhury points out, nature, one can also call it life in Nietzsche, prior to its separation from history is, and I quote from Choudhury, continuously modulated instinctual life of the human animal. Unquote. But once history is given meaning, assigned a value, and thereby dissociated from nature or life, nature becomes the opposite of history. Therefore, nature is also now given a meaning. And this is the interesting part, that nature becomes an object of representation. So, nature is wild, beastly, deadly, even sublime, as Choudhury points out. So, while history gains a certain value, a certain narrative, one can say, another narrative is deployed to also capture nature. Now, when history is signified as the domain for the production of meaning, it is transformed into a necessity. This is a destinal attitude, which signifies history as the place of necessity. History becomes the place of production of necessary meaning. To assign meaning to history, to name history, are all related operations which transform history into a necessity. This makes history into a norm. It becomes a place to seek legitimacy. But this destinal attitude, which signifies history as the place of necessity, also, and this is the interesting thing, that it also retroactively signifies nature as contingent. That is, it names nature as contingent. However, nature represented as contingent, wild, disorderly, against history, which is necessary, normative, orderly, and meaningful, is different from the real of nature, which is, as Choudhury had pointed out, continuously modulated instinctual life. In other words, representation of nature as contingent and the real contingency of nature operate at two different levels. The label or the name of contingency is a value, a norm ascribed to nature from the point of view of history. Inversely, to call history a place of necessity is a historical operation, which in reality, like all of history, is contingent. It is a double bind, that is the point. It is a double bind of history and nature, where they become indistinguishable and by the same gesture separated from each other. And this is the problem of modernity. When something like a new contingent natural phenomena is named as a norm, as something normal, the new normal, for example, we see this double binding of history and nature being played out. What appears to be a separation of life from everything historical and political, where the preeminence of life is highlighted beyond all political and social contradictions, which is what is done, which is what Choudhury Soumyabrata analyzes in the first chapter, that how there is in the name of the virus a certain retreat of the political. That is the very point where nature is transformed into a historical necessity. And the retreat of the political in that sense, which I'm sure other people will also talk about, the retreat of the political becomes the very mode of political expression. From this point of view of the double bind of history and nature, let me just dwell upon the question of time briefly before concluding. The question of time is perhaps the secret heart of Soumyabrata Choudhury's book. It not only talks of the different conducts of time, as Deleuze had once called, which unfolds differently for the different classes, but points to what Choudhury calls duration, a complex but essential concept lying hidden in the interstices of the book's many critical operations. I cannot elaborate on the problem of duration and how Soumyabrata's book deploys it, how it is different from the concept of duration proposed by Bergson and later developed by Deleuze, and where they coincide. These have to be done with enormous patience and time. I will just try to present a brief schematization of the temporal imagination of the book. You see, the discourse of a vaccine is in the horizon. Now that the discourse of a vaccine is in the horizon, the COVID crisis has been given a certain narrative. There is a mood of hope which informs the discourse of the current crisis. It is projected as a crisis which had a definite beginning, a middle, and an end, as someone once said. Now, this is a historical interpretation of a natural biological crisis, insofar as history is the great factory of signification. It does not really matter if the vaccine actually produces result, actually ends the reign of the virus, as long as a possible end, the possibility of such end can be narrativized. We can go on living our lives in its everyday repetitions of the present moment. The infinite accumulation of what the German philosopher Walter Benjamin called empty homogeneous time, which today coincides with a certain ideology of presentism. What is presentism? Presentism means that only the present sustained by this repetition of the same is useful. Presentism is in that sense the temporal form of a positive society, a society of transparency, a society of accumulation, today's consumer society, in other words. So through deploying a logic of a possible end, the present is secured. But there is another more interesting implication of this, I think. It shows that nature has been completely historicized. What in a somewhat different context Choudhury calls historical naturalism. But if we look at it a bit more carefully, we see, and again I want to underline this, that we see that this historicization of nature is very similar to the historicization of a certain Christian theology which took place very slowly over a long period, culminating in the Enlightenment in the West. To put this point very briefly, Christian theology understood history as having a definite beginning, middle, and end. Very similar to what is being argued today about a natural entity, the virus. But this idea faced a crisis when history actually did not come to an end as Christian theology had promised. So, in order not to become irrelevant, theology had to change its proposition of an actual end of history and replace it with a possible end of history, an imminent end in the future. This possible end allowed theology to legitimize itself in modernity by calling every truly historical contingent moment, every historical change, a continuation of itself. That is a continuation of theology. This was the position of someone like Carl Schmitt, who claimed that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. The historicization of theology was characterized by this effort to call every truly historical change illegitimate. In other words, historicized theology was the counter-revolutionary project to render revolutionary historical change as illegitimate. I think something similar is at work with historical naturalization. When unpredictable natural crises are given a historical narrative as having a beginning, middle, and end, and therefore rendered illegitimate as a contingent natural event, while the true legitimacy is given to the necessary continuation of the present moment of history, which is capital. Capital which becomes a natural historical necessity and therefore legitimate. So from crisis as a new normalcy, there is suddenly the delegitimacy of the crisis as nothing but a phase in history which is soon to be over. We shall therefore return to the present of capital, the present which offers legitimacy to the end of history. Against this presentism, Soumyabrata Choudhury's book offers another way to understand time as duration. Duration, I think, as Choudhury understands it, is also the question of the present. But it is a present which is interruptive rather than repetitive, a present which is subtractive rather than accumulative. It is an impossible present. As Choudhury had written in the preface to his first book, Theatre Number Event, a present which always escapes. I'll just take another 5 minutes.
Sure.
That is okay.
Yeah, you're well within time, yeah.
Soumyabrata Choudhury invites us to think politics at this very moment of its impossibility, which the current crisis provides an opportunity for. The derailment of ideological practices and the confusion of the current world provides the occasion to understand the reality of our current world rigged with social and class contradictions as a historical problem which is contingent, unnatural, and therefore open to the possibility of change. In other words, crisis is the condition for critique, when criticality has come into a state of crisis. The exercise of critical historical intelligence, which Soumyabrata Choudhury talks about in this chapter, is a demand to subtract oneself from this double bind of nature and history, which is what Choudhury calls social stupidity. What Choudhury calls a global proletarization is such a critical historical consciousness. For instance, that is global proletarization interrupts the contemporary abstraction of poverty as an ethical imperative. I cannot develop this here, but let me just point this out. So it interrupts the contemporary abstraction of poverty as an ethical imperative. A truly critical understanding of poverty from the point of view of global proletarization replaces the current understanding, replaces the current metaphysics of global poverty as the bad outcome of capital and resituates it as an ontological problem founded upon the systematic reproduction of class relations. It demands a task of thinking which allows for a possibility of change which is political and not merely ethical when it comes to the question of poverty. But this change has to be preceded by a critical consciousness, which Choudhury calls global proletarization. Now, will it retain the name proletariat? We are not sure. But the problem of global proletarization has to be a question of desire and not merely a question of norms of representation. What name it takes, what name it takes, this consciousness cannot be named, whatever name it takes, whatever name this critical attitude of global proletarization brings forth, that name cannot be a norm, that name cannot be a necessity. Then we are again back to the same trap from where we started. It has to be open to naming the unpredictable upsurge of separating oneself from the double entanglement of history and nature, necessity and contingency of capital. Historical intelligence has to be committed to the, and here I quote Choudhury, and I quote, it has to be committed to the instantaneous force of an experience which is differentiated from other sedimented experience along the flow of time. This differentiated instant of experience is unstable, contingent, and a function of the situation of history. No general or natural universality can attach to a historical experience. And here I come to the end of this brief presentation. Let me just say finally, I think that the desire to find a language of subtraction, which is present in Choudhury's book, is indistinguishable from another desire, which is internal to thinking. To find a way to articulate the desire for emancipatory politics is not in itself exclusively a political desire, but a philosophical one. It is a difficult but essential effort of philosophy to find a form, a language, to express the non-expressive utterances of pure desire. The last two chapters of the book are perhaps the most philosophical because they are symptomatic of this effort. It is not a question of celebration of naked transgressive desire now that law is abandoned or destroyed. It is an effort to find new names for such unknown, unnameable, impossible desires, which evokes Choudhury's own singular desire for thinking. The migrant's desire, the lover's desire, the desire of the woman who asked what is to be done in Shaheen Bagh has to be supplemented with Choudhury's own desire for thinking at the very point of its impossibility. They are all moments of non-expressive utterances, which are all gathered together in the book through what Choudhury evocatively calls comparative passion. Comparative passion, I think, is nothing but thought's internal relation to itself, philosophy's desire to think. This desire, and I quote Choudhury here, this comparative passion which passes through us in our isolation, unquote, it oscillates between two poles, association and isolation. One can think of association today as that which subtracts itself from the homogeneous ideology of isolation. The exceptionality of our isolated condition made into a norm spells out the melancholy of our contemporary historical condition. The name for this historical melancholy is the new normal. This is the uniform isolation against which Choudhury urges us to think of the subtractive isolation of thinking, which passes through us creating new possibilities of associational thinking. This is an exceptional association, an association which isolates itself, separates itself, subtracts itself from the survivalist association of COVID society. The two terms, association and isolation, are caught in this subtractive logic, while individually they produce their own internal dialectics. Association is also isolation, while isolation also produces association. But at the same time, association is radically separated from isolation. I think the book not only evokes and tries to formalize certain non expressive utterances, but it is in itself a non expressive utterance, which is best captured by the subtitle Association and Isolation. Everything is precariously balanced in that which separates and binds them together. Thank you.
Thank you, Soumick. That was really, really nice. See, when I hear something like this, and when we frame this book with a kind of a prefatory set of utterances made by some of the people who are going to be speaking today, in terms of their response, because before it became a book, we remember most of us here and maybe more people that day, before the book's publication, gathered to again discuss the manuscript or the first form in which it was there circulating around, and it has there's a duration from that to this materiality of the book. And Soumick was very right in saying, it tries to show more. Its own desire for thinking is also to express the non-expressive utterance, the utterance of new desire. So I will ask Anu to come in now. I hope we'll all stick to, Soumick has more or less stuck to his time. So if we all stick to the 7 to 8 minutes in the next few presentations, we will be able to have a nice, good response from Shomo and the Q&A after that. So over to Anu, whom I'm literally seeing after many years, not literally, virtually. There you are.
Hi.
She used to be in the Central University of Hyderabad, where I also studied in the same years. Thank you, Anu. Over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anand. Actually, it's a pleasure to see you again too. I have actually, just put down a few thoughts from my reading of the book. Not singly reading it, but reading it together with several others, actually. So, in a sense, I guess it condenses things that we have been discussing over a longer period of time. I cannot really claim any, sort of single, voice over this. And so also, I mean, it is absolutely, in a sense, somewhat, sort of a citation of Shomu's book as well. And one of the other things that I would like to actually briefly reflect upon before I read the few paragraphs that I've written is that how over the period of the lockdown especially, some of these conversations kept, coming back regarding especially the question of education, for instance, and the question of students, because I do teach at a university, and student fees, student hostels, online education, and things like that. So it is part of a variety of what I've actually summarized here. Actually, touches upon a variety of different kinds of engagements that I've been having with several others in the past, sort of few months. Am I audible?
Yeah, clear.
Yeah, okay. So without taking further time, I would just like to read the brief note that I've written here. And please pause me if something is not clear. In the preface to the book, Shomo speaks almost demurringly of an impasse, quote unquote, an impasse, as one of the possible risks of the subjective wager that the book, in the very act of its composition, makes on politics, of being that, quote, active proposal towards the material creation of a new life, or alternatively, the creation of a new materiality, the materiality of new ideas to live for, italics, end quote. The somewhat anachronistic nature of this rhetorically posed question about the possibility of the traversal of an impasse, which prevents any further movement of things or of words or things, which could be seen as synonymous with the situation we have been put into by the virus, is that the book itself is antecedent to the preface, and as Shomu points out, is in a sense already an account of his infinite traversal of that impasse, to which the preface attempts to return it away from the clamor, quote, of words that has gone on for a bit too long, end quote. Such is the startling and courageous commitment to the traversal of the impasse, which, as Shomu elsewhere suggests, uh, like the book itself, was that of an isolation that grew too clamorous as he began to make and compare notes with others. And as this comparative passion gave duration to isolation, quote, and converted it first into, quote again, the solitude of the solitary note taker, and then into, quote, a certain delicate and perilous point of thought, end quote, especially in the form of the co-author Vaibhav's, quote, long and winding notes, whose interlocution, both at the level of thought and existence, even across distances, embodied to Shomu the capacity to make sense of the, quote, nonsense of the experience of the impasse. And moving on, in the week before the world turned official again through and through, students, along with some teachers, echoed the question raised by the young woman from Shaheen Bagh: what is to be done? A student recently shared how her experience of initially collectively protesting the online mode of education as a violation of the principle of equal access during the pandemic was eventually traded for and replaced with the sense of a gradual acceptance of the actual fact of online education. Another student who described herself as having been an, quote, educational tourist before the pandemic has adjusted herself to what she understands as the temporary hiatus to normalcy caused by the pandemic, and blithely justifies the need for social distancing as a form of evolution of humankind, a biological evolution of humankind. Yet another student, having come very close to experiencing personal loss due to coronavirus, states that isolation is the essence of our human condition. And this is a quotation from her. When further quizzed about the Stoic formulation, she responds with the suggestion that there are certain stories that are difficult to share. The experience of the impasse is that the word coronavirus, since it not only separates bodies across spaces, but in that isolation also reduces them to the, quote, mere life of mortals, end quote, it disables the capacity for thinking even from the existentially common ground of the experience of that very mortality. The physical isolation in extreme circumstances for the involuntary subjects of a pandemic, quote, thus translates into an existential and affectively lived negativity that exposes the inefficacy of the subjective internalization of the so-called, quote unquote, new normal. The exercise of sharing such notes in online discussions eventually could bring us back from, and this is what I would end with, a certain note of hope, I guess, the time of distances, which is a world without encounters. And from the event of the pandemic, to which, as Sir says, in principle, all of us belong as the subjects of a pandemic. We could then perhaps digitally, quote, encounter the historicality of the truths affirmed by the protesters of Shaheen Bagh and the migrant walkers with whom we declare in affirmative solidarity, and within the twin impasses of the impossible durations of both walking on the road and trying to teach about that duration online, and therefore affirming that we are here, so we belong here. In that sense of duration. So
thank you, Hanu.
Just
Thank you.
something
So, is there more you're adding? Sorry, did I?
No. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. That was very crisp, and thank you so much. I was also thinking between Soumik and Anu about how do we read? Is he comfortable when we were trying to describe what kind of thought that Shomo is trying to facilitate? Do you call him a philosopher? Do you call him a teacher? Teacher he is, of course. And recently I sent a copy of the book to somebody, I won't name him again, somebody who teaches in New York, who also responds to the calling of philosophy. But he said what is so attractive about Soumyabrata's work is that he's not 100% a philosopher nor a literary scholar, which is why I feel a certain affinity. So who next in the alphabetical list? I was just, yeah, there you are, Brahma Prakash, yes. Somebody I've had casual conversations with whenever I've gone to JNU, to the Arts and Aesthetic Department in and around that. Thank you, Brahm, for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Over to you then. You will have the same 7-8 minutes that Anu did.
Yeah.
Hi, Brahm, you're there?
Yes.
There, okay.
Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Very clearly. You're in JNU?
Great. So thank you so much, Anand, for giving me this opportunity. And let me begin with congratulating Soumyabrata Choudhury and Navyana Publication, Prabuddha Collective, and University at the Madhum for organizing this event. I was really looking for. So, some of the points, I'm not coming from philosophy background, so I will try to I take a lot of interest in protest that is happening, and we all have been engaging directly or indirectly. So perhaps I will be talking from that point of view. So when we are discussing about this book now, it has come to distances. We are familiar, or let us say that we are getting familiarized with this whole idea of the distances. But where do we get this sense of coming? So for me, this whole idea of the coming becomes more interesting that way. So I think the sense of coming comes more closely in Martin Numel's prophetic poem, First They Came. We all keep quoting this poem, that first they came for the Jews, first they came for the socialists. And so this poem goes like this, that first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. The poem already has a sense of internalized distances, differences. When they were getting attacked, we were silent. When they were marching in Delhi, we could not come out of our doorstep. But the authoritarianism was not only coming for the communists, Jews or Muslims for that sense, it was also coming in a different forms. It was risking our spaces. It was assimilating in our rhythm. It was encoding our movements. It might not have sanitized our bodies directly, but it was sanitizing our behaviors. It was sleeping in our dreams. And suddenly it has come so close that we were speaking in their words. One day it was walking with us because it wanted to come in between, it wanted to create that distances. And now it has come to distances is about a historical crossing of a threshold that often failed to become an event. It is, of course, a crossing about what Foucault would say, the threshold of biological modernity, but it is also about a thresholding of the vision of what we can see and cannot see. Therefore, these distances are not only a spatial and durational in this sense, it is also about the grafting of the new sense of distances themselves. The very axis of distances have reformulated. It is grafted on a new formula of contagion, where 2 and 2 is not necessarily 4, but can be infinite. More than 5 is not a name, but a label. 6 feet is not the size of the body one can map, but the name of the new lowest one can think about. It is a minimum of the minimal, it becomes a kind of minimalist in that way that you cannot go further minimal in that sense. It is not about the size that we are talking about, it is about the siege. The Prime Minister's invocation of Lakshman Rekha clearly says it all, that it is not about the distances, it is about the something more than duration and distances that we need to think about. So what we hear in this announcement is new sign of coming. सामाजिक दूरी का सम्मान रखें. So this whole idea of the social distance has to be respected. And same way, when the Prime Minister was talking, he was also talking about the divine citizenship. Then, of course, we are not talking about certain morality of the distances. We are talking about something more deeper. So don't assemble, don't mingle, don't come close. Assembly is contagion. In common is contagion. The sharing is contagion. Every closing down indicates, or locking down indicates, that closeness is contagion in that sense. This appears to be an architecture of thinking in which the books assembles, and when I'm discussing about the book, then now it has come to distances, assembles principles and communities from theater, plague, citizenship to the great Sahibag. Saying now it has come to distances means that it has come so close that distance may become the norm. And that is what Somo is indicating towards in this book. Somo reflects on this point saying that, and I would like to quote him, our biological life has become a paramount. It sets out the parameter that ought to be followed for this purpose. We thus become subject of the new, quote-unquote, new normal, which presents itself as a neutral and necessary, even it is instrumental and ideological, which is to say, we ideologically internalize the meaning or signification of a situation as exceptional to the point of believing it to be pure phenomenon of a new biological natural destinies. What we have internalized is the loss of a smile, shaking of the hands, lending the support. The quote closes. So what we have internalized in this formula is that loss of a smile, shaking of the hands, lending the support, collective idea of the collective mourning, letting fall the bodies to be held by somebody else. Overall, maintaining a distance from whatever can be contagion. Even one is resisting these right things at the thinking level, what one realizes that bodies have been so accommodative to these biopolitical changes that within a year, we have accommodated many, many things. That not to shake the hands, not to go closer, and has been so so fastly, so much internalized. And you have philosopher, cultural philosopher Daniel Lorenzini, and he rightly points out that instead of worrying about the increase of surveillance mechanism, and now we are thinking about leaving WhatsApp and joining Signal, and indiscriminate control under a new state of exception, one needs to worry about the fact that we already are so docile, obedient to biopolitical subjects. The book hints to the different formation in which distances come against different comings, and I would like to read it as a becomings. And because when we are trying to pose this idea of the distancing, then distances has come against something. And that idea of something was something was coming, something was becoming, and therefore distances was a kind of a strategy. It came against the assembly of Sahimbag. It has come against the new subjectivity who came from the kitchen to the streets. It is a planted distance against the potential political subjects who were considered apolitical until now, thinking about women, thinking about children who are either coming for farmers' protest now, or who were coming to Sahimbag, and that way we can think about how apolitical was becoming political, and therefore to stop that kinds of coming or becoming, this distance has come as a kind of new political strategy. This is what Somo points out. So he writes, violent rights and genocidal anti-minority programs aim to either annihilate the potential bodies to be traversed by the courage of thoughts by reducing them to a state of mortal threat. So distancing and, of course, like output. So distancing is not only the isolation of the bodies, but also isolation of the thoughts in that sense. And of course, many thinkers, if you are thinking about philosophy, if you are thinking about writers, then you have many thinkers, writers who produce remarkable thinking and literature in isolation. But this isolation is different, and that is what Somu again indicates towards, because this distancing, this isolation comes with the sense of saturation, because every time you go in isolation, you get further saturated, and that is what this distance is trying to create. So what we have read in the first chapter is indeed what we are witnessing today, and therefore I will see that book becomes very, very relevant if you are reading the contemporary protest in India, or what is happening in many parts of the world also. So chapter Shaheen Bagh, an immortal association, laughs at the dictatorship of the mortals, becomes so true. The dictator would have forced out that it would end the association, formation of alliances, and that is what they were trying to do initially when coronavirus spread, and that was the whole idea, that how to break the association, how to create certain kinds of ruptures so people cannot come out. But movements of our time, the Black Lives Matter and farmers' protest, have proved that alliances is not name of the political strategy that one can think about. It is the way of the it is the very condition of humanity. And there is a report today in Indian Express. Some of you must have read it. So the report goes like this: a groom and his barat on way to the wedding venue made a quick stop at the toll plaza to lend their support to the protest against the new farm laws. What Somu writes, that how an immortal association laughs at the dictatorship of mortals, that becomes so metaphorical, so true in that sense. As much as the state tries to individualize the assembly, it also puts in the challenge of what Somu again writes, auto-infection. So every time you are trying to create this sense of individuation, you are trying to break the movement, you are also seeing this whole uproar of new kinds of infection, and that can be considered as auto-infection in that sense. And that is what the way he's trying to describe it. I will end my presentation by bringing one more point where Somu quotes Ambedkar and hints towards the communal question. He hints that the communal question must be posed in a new, unforeseen way. It means Muslim not as a religious ritual efficacy, but as a wager of a historical name. When Kangana Ranawat says that Bilkis Banu was seen in the farmers' movement, and then it is not a slip that she is making. She is only validating the very historical subject, whose name can be Bilkis Banu or Mahinder Kaur. While she is too abstract to be taken seriously, I will still credit her for reading through the sign. In fact, she is not that interested in the Mahinder Kaur or Bilkis Banu. What she is interested in, the fear of emergence of the historical subject itself, in which old mothers have emerged as a figure of social jest. They embody the gestures of thinking, like one can say, like breath, Mother Courage, for that matter. While the book analyzes the concrete examples of citizenship, of theater, of plague, but they are the name of the situation in which the book will become relevant time and again. One can read ongoing farmers' protest through the Shaheen Bagh, for that matter. Nobody has ever thought that women and children will be again sitting on the roads. Nobody has ever thought that the young will be again leading the march. Nobody has ever thought that the city will again come to the Chakka Jam at any given point of time. What we are witnessing is an anecdote, the tale that can be told many times. The book has the metaphor of theater and plague, but language of parables for that matter. And therefore it becomes so relevant. It is relevant in the context which when a minority becomes the fundamental subject of history. I would again like to congratulate Soumyabrata Choudhury and Ayyala publication for this great success. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Brahm. Somebody like Brahm has also written a few essays on the ongoing farmers' protest and on Shaheen Bagh, of course. And I have also caught myself thinking about the comparisons and little more generosity with which there is a farmers' protest is being seen in terms of the support it gets, and the contrast with the name Muslim that comes to be immediately associated with Shaheen Bagh. We'll have chance to come back to these possible comparisons and what seems like an outpouring of support globally in terms of even monetary support, in terms of even the kind of cross cross something that won't happen with a Dalit or Muslim issue is also unfolding here. So over to Huzaifa now, who's another person. This is again the solidarity with strangers that a book like this enables, because this is the first time I'm probably seeing him as a picture on my screen at least. So he is also doing his PhD in JNU, and the first time I encountered his name was when, surprise, there was the only review in a popular forum for the first book, which we published, Ambedkar and Other Immortals, which was in Scroll that Huzaifa wrote. And then he recently did this interview from which we took this little quote for the poster as well. So Huzaifa also has done a essay recently in the Wire where he talks about the other book that the Indian edition which we published, Aishwari Kumar's work, and looks at how these two books kind of offer a departure from earlier modes of thinking. So over to Huzaifa.
Okay, thank you, Anand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anand, and thank you, Vaibhav, for having organized this discussion. And thank you, sir, for writing the book. So I would like to begin by saying that technically, Shoma sir hasn't been my teacher. I've not attended any classes by him as such. But in so many ways, he has been my teacher. And one of the strangest things about being a student is that you have two phases in which you can respond to your teachers. Either you have to begin first of all by imitating them. And in the process of imitating them, slowly you end up betraying them. So I haven't got to the second phase yet.
Okay.
So I'm just beginning, in a sense, to imitate what sir is doing and what sir is giving us as thought. And so in that process of imitation, because sir is a philosopher, and the philosopher is a person who creates concepts. So as in that process of imitation, I have tried to create a certain concept that would perhaps be relevant to understand not just what sir is doing, but other people as well in India. A kind of thinking that is happening. And I've just tried to give it a name. That name, as some might have read it, is called subcontinental philosophy. And I don't use this term as some kind of flashy new concept or anything, because nothing of what I said in that essay, if people have read it, is mine. What I've been trying to actually bring out is that there is in India right now, and many of the people here are the people who are participating in this, that in India right now there is a certain movement, a movement which can be said to desire a kind of synthesis. A kind of synthesis between what? A kind of synthesis between two seemingly irreconcilable philosophies, which is that of Badiou, who has his generic humanity, generic universality, subtraction, and that of Deleuze, who has difference in itself, who has assemblage, flux, networks, all these things. These are two irreconcilable philosophies. And right now in India, suddenly we have been thrust into this position, not just a theoretical position, but a kind of existential position where we have to grapple with these two philosophies, where we have to, in a certain sense, assert difference in itself as well as equality. And that is what I found fascinating about Sir's, all of Sir's books, beginning from his first book, Theatre, Number Event, his second book, Ambedkar, Now Other Immortals, and now his third book. And in the third book, what makes it very interesting for me is that there is this moment in which Sir brings out these problems, not in a sense that make them not solve the problem, because that's not the purpose of a philosopher. A philosopher does not solve problems. A philosopher presents problems. And if Sir is presenting the problem that you can name, or that I feel that is coming out, especially in this book, is the problem of inconsistency. Because what happened in the 20th century especially is that a lot of the dialectic, the Hegelian Marxian dialectic that was always focused on contradiction was, challenged throughout. And the contradiction, the thought of contradiction itself became something that we do not want to think anymore. We want to think differences. We want to think diversity. We do not want to think contradiction. And with Sir's book, in this book, there are two figures, maybe even three figures of inconsistency. The first are the immortals of Shaheen Bagh, who are, of course, and this is, I wrote about this, who are women who are not just women, they are women who are clad in burqas and hijabs. They are literally invisible women. They're literally the women you walk by on the streets and you don't know who they are. They are invisible. So that's the first figure of inconsistency or invisibility that Sir brings up. The second figure is the migrant worker. The migrant worker is the one we go to a restaurant and there are some people serving us food. We don't even look at them. There are some people driving our Ubers. We don't even look at them. They are not just invisible because we as people don't look at them, but because they are structurally invisible. They are inconsistent with the structures of the visible world. And what happens with this book that Sir has brought out is that there is this necessity to integrate this invisible, this inconsistent into what is our consistent world. And this necessity, which is not, an ethical necessity, it's a thinkable and therefore a logical necessity. But what would this logical necessity entail? That I do not know. I really don't know. But I understand that this is a logical and not an ethical necessity. And therefore, this necessity that has to be thought is not just a theoretical thing. It is actually a political act. To think the migrant worker, to think the burqa-clad woman at Shaheen Bagh is to actually change what is happening around us, to change the visible. And this book that I've read, and I've had an interview with Sir, so I've had a lot of conversation with him about it. I don't want to go more into it. That this book brings out that problem. And therefore, it makes us, it allows us to open a space in which we can again contribute to what Sir calls philosophy. And that is what is the most interesting thing about what is happening right now, an event maybe. So thank you. I mean, I don't have much more to say. I've already spoken so much to Sir that I can't say much. But thank you, Anand, for having me at this conversation.
Thank you, Huzaifa. I mean, you did say much. It's not about the length of time you spoke for. Thank you. That was really pithy and a kind of a way to help us think about what this kind of thinking and what this kind of thinking is part of. It's part of something larger. And right now, this discussion is very much, as you rightly pointed out, part of that larger program that is happening. So it is like the subtitle of the second book that he wrote, Ambedkar. It's a research project, right? So that is what is ongoing, a research project. So now over to three names with S, and there goes Saket.
Yes.
Hi, Saket.
Hi.
Can we see you? Can we also
So
have you on video, or is there a problem?
yeah, so my internet is very low. It is
Okay, that's okay.
Am I audible?
You're very clearly audible. There is absolutely no issue in the sound.
So first of all, I thank you all to assemble here to this online discussion, and I thank you, Shomu sir, that he wrote this book, and because of this all discussion is possible. So I have written something, and I'll start reading it. Speaking in one's own voice. Some notes on duration. Today I'm going to, in my own capacity, try and speculatively think on the question of duration and its possible relation with sound. The question of duration is crucial to now it comes to distances. It is distributed in almost all the chapters of the book. I may not be able to touch upon its complexities, still here I try. So I would like to begin with my encounter with the master. Somewhere there it all began. Something began, hence something is also ending. The thing that is ending is mere denial of the rotting and noisy existence of the old forms and bodies, a certain nihilistic approach to all of the life, a belief that nothing new is possible. because everything seemed to have rotten and all voices in the air seemed totally chaotic. All that was meant to be beautiful was turned into mere object of pleasure and consumption and end in itself. After that encounter, things also began and still are beginning in parts as I begin to think again. As I go on thinking, I'm killing the undead static God repeatedly, God the old master. This act of killing this undead God, that is the act of true thinking, is only thinkable along with the master, more precisely with a master of thought, who for me has inaugurated the new signification of the old name master and its relation to change. Master is someone who at one point in his life decides to change, which is to say, master can be anyone who is capable of taking decisions while enduring in the strangeness of the thoughts and move ahead in the light of previous decisions while continue to endure in the strangeness of the other. So let me begin with the passage from the Ambedkar and Other Immortals. In my view, what this passage proposes is very relevant while engaging with any thought of and by the other. In quotes, the possibility requires to be examined that instead of merely thrilling to and being moved by the words of Ambedkar, what is the process of reading those words exactly, faithfully and historically? Which is to ask, how does one read immersed in the alien solitude of the words while never give up on speaking in one's own voice in the clamor of the present? Let us summarize this point by saying that to speak in one's own voice means to be able to find the words of one's own decisions. End quote. So let me ask some naive questions. What is this idea of speaking in one's own voice that is evoked in this passage? Does it have to do with the spiritual inner voice or a calling or a struggle or to reach that place or that source of that voice? It is definitely not that sort of a spatial urge to unify with that voice or the place. Then what is this own voice? A biological voice, a voice that can be owned by the body, a voice that is being generated from everybody's vocal cord, a natural voice? Or is it a metaphor of something else that voice literally than what voice literally means? So let's get back to the passage. It is said in the passage, speaking in one's own voices means to be able to find the words for one's own decisions. Which is to say, to speak in one's own voice is to give consistency to the series of inconsistent decisions with the help of language and its utterances. So in the above passage, what does voice really signify? Is it only the utterance of language or the words? I would like to propose that voice here is signifying duration, more precisely signifying the creation of duration. Let me try to elaborate. One's own voice in this case is also an extension of exceptionality of Ambedkar thought in the clamor of the present, in the clamor of the present times. A singular voice that extends that singular thought in its temporal inconsistencies. Or one can also say voices in general extends or creates consistency in something which is inconsistent and yet one's own, that is decision. As I said above, that is as said above, that what is one's own voice is an extension of what is always one's own but inconsistent decision. On the one hand, voice possibly is an extension of the body to which it doesn't belong completely. It is a trace of the otherness. On the other hand, while it is extending the existence of thoughts and its subjects, that is not the body, it creates a sound relation with thoughts and body while creating a sense of consistent duration of and for the subject of thought. So now I would like to move further and try to draw a relation between sound and movement of thought. Listening and thinking, a strange passage of time. Sound is always distant or at a distance, even in a situation. There is something strange about it, a consistent strangeness, yet inconsistency in its travel, or a movement. It is there in the air, always away from the hole or a gap of the ears, yet reaching it with some alterations. Ears cannot be closed, they are always open, and so is the gap between the thoughts. The thoughts wander just like the sound wanders. The only possibility of making this strange, infinite, inconsistent passage consistent is by listening and thinking to and on its strangeness, by associating with its strangeness and the stranger, while passing through the anxious gap it creates by reconstituting, by resignifying this strangeness away from its appearances and image. Now it comes to distances, repeatedly demonstrates that this distance or the impasse actualized by a pandemic, may it be physical, ideological, political, in love, is a gap between a thought or an idea and its subject. Only possible yet seemingly impossible way to pass through it or move away from it is to think through it historically. This process, in a technical term, can be named as a process of subjectivation. Subjectivation, by tracing the passing of the air through gaps of thinking and listening and the residue it leaves behind, is a remainder. This residue or the remainder is to trace more and to decide more on the inconsistent gaps and the desires they create. So thinking and listening as such is to a decision of giving time or maybe to create time, question mark. I believe, at least in the artistic processes, sound performs a function that creates duration. Duration that is constituted by the whole and loopholes of hearing and listening, audible and inaudible. Image, image as image is in the void of duration. It is isolated in spatial sense, whereas isolation that sound generates is an isolation with certain openings or gaps. I also think that in forms like theater and film, sound may change the signification of the image. It can shatter the imaginary meaning of it. From its appearance to what the image can possibly mean when sound intervenes, a new meaning of the sound image, a symbolic meaning. All these are only scattered speculations, some residues and echoes of the things I thought while reading the book collectively with my friends. A book that can pass on the courage as infection. Maybe this line of inquiry, which I very roughly spoke of, is possible in the process of art in our times. I wish to keep at it. Who knows, maybe the immemorial, hence rotten and old sound of Om is just the humming noise of the wind blowing or a sound of silent room tone. Who knows, while dealing with these questions of sound and its relation with duration, we might stumble upon a possibility that what we know as language is not the only possible structure of it. A structure without hierarchy of images and places is possible. I would like to stop twisting my tongue here. Thank you so much to all of you for listening and hearing me so patiently. Maybe may the great possibility of association of strangers be more thinkable as one thinks of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saket. What we know of language goes beyond the structure we know of it. And not yet having met Saket, I do know he works with sound and music, with cinema. So his idea of around thought and sound and listening and thinking, listening as thinking, very useful. Thank you, Saket. So next up is Shiraz Iqbal, another person with whom I have corresponded over the years. He was in fact one of the early readers of our book, Beat Brahmins and Broken Men. Thank you, Shiraz, for joining us. This is the first time again I'm seeing you as such. Hi, Shiraz. Over to you now.
Hi, everybody. Hi, sir. Hi. Some new friends are also here who are sort of coming to the book for the first time. So I want to begin by actually saying, as I was reading this book, I could not keep my thoughts limited to any one of the essays, because this book is a book of essays. as we passed through the pandemic. Neither could I keep myself within this book. I kept jumping back to Sir's earlier book and other essays. And so what follows is I'm going to attempt an experiment. So I apologize in advance. I've written out something like a sketch of myself thinking, observing myself thinking as I read. Now it's come to distances. And I have taken a word, a phrase which Sir uses in Ambedkar and Other Immortals, which is Sir's last book. At the beginning, Sir calls himself a reader student of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Ever since that book, I feel in community with Prabuddha Collective and University at the Margins. And now I hope after today, with more of you who have joined us for the first time, I hope we will all be reader students. So this is, without further ado, this is something like an invitation to read together. So my note is, and one more apology, I may have got a little carried away. Anand, so please feel free to stop me. I think it may be slightly over time. So do let me know, yeah?
Sure.
So the note is titled, A Reader Student Traverses Citizenship. Small background is, the reason for this is because reading the book helped me unravel a puzzle that was like, there was something vague. I was very uncertain during the CAA protests, I was at the protest, and at a certain point, I changed my Instagram handle to Citizen Shiraz. In solidarity with everyone and with the readings of the preamble. But after some discussions with Sir, I was vaguely, very uncertain about keeping that, and I removed the sort of tag citizen from my Insta handle, and I just went back to being Shiraz. So now when I reread Now It's Come to Distances, I feel I can articulate why I would rather not call myself citizen in this moment. So this is The reader student chances upon a counterintuitive assertion in the middle of Professor Choudhury's book of passage. Towards the end of the essay on citizenship, the author declares that despite appearances, what the government of the communal majority desires is not the dissolution of the constitution. What it would like to dissolve, or at least have its subjects avoid, like the plague, the professor seems to be asserting, is the courage of thought. The reader student begins to ruminate. So what if the free citizen begins to think? Hadn't she begun already to wonder about her rights, her place in this country, in the clamorous weeks leading up to those first insistent warnings to retreat from civic life? Hadn't she, in the lively fervor of her local Bagh? For a while, it seemed there was a Shaheen Bagh in every city. Hadn't she too proclaimed herself citizen? But then she remembers herself being addressed as one among the Janta. That was when a suspicion crept in. Was she being addressed as one among those on the side of the Bharatiya Janata Party? Or was she just being paranoid? Probably paranoia. Anyway, on television, the Prime Minister was asking his subjects to ready themselves for war against the virus. The government, he said, had already swung into action to set up a COVID-19 task force. And just like the Italians, who had gathered on their balconies on the 13th of March to applaud medical staff, police personnel, and delivery and transportation service workers, the Bharatiya Janata too was called to its duty. They were to assemble in strict separation on their respective balconies to boost the morale of the quote-unquote national protectors, a congregation in spirit. Another paranoid flicker. National protectors, the word used was Rashtra Rakshak. Isn't that what they call our soldiers? And another paranoid flicker. It seems the government's COVID-19 task force has been set up to focus solely on economic challenges and the essential work of fighting on the local biological front of this global war is delegated solely to the Rakshaks. But then what war was the entire Janta being asked to prepare for? The reader student recalls a scene and its analysis, which opens the final chapter of Professor Choudhury's previous book. And now I quote, "In his History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides presents Pericles' famous funeral oration to the Athenian citizens and others gathered to honor the soldiers who died fighting the Spartans. Surprisingly, the greater part of the speech is devoted not to the soldiers and their bravery, but to praising the natural civic immortality of Athens," Professor Choudhury points out. It is only reasonable, according to Pericles, that the brave soldier chooses a noble death for the sake of his unique city, whose society and politics, over time, have reached an acme of perfection. End quote. In a flash, the reader student understands. As one among the Janta who were being assembled in ritual civic solidarity, she was being prepared for an indefinite interregnum through which, as quote unquote free citizen, she was free to choose to be on the correct side, the side of the autochthonous society, the traditional society, whose noble quote unquote way of life she has been born into. Lakshman Rekha, Agni Pariksha weren't the references the Prime Minister deployed in each subsequent speech, drawn from the Ramayana, whose Ram Raj is the mythological ideal for the communal majority's Hindu Rashtra. In just the first few days after the PM's first national pandemic address, it is evident from the police governance on the street, which is at times vicious and at times creatively humiliating, that there are only two sides, the correct one or the wrong one. On 24th March 2020, sure enough, the police forcefully evicted all those remaining on the wrong side, that is, on the streets, from Shaheen Baghs across the national capital. Again, she asks, what global war was the Janta being prepared for? If the Janta really is nothing but the set of citizens who are, as Sir says, constitutively on the side of the modern legal state, for which nothing is more serious and chaotic or obvious as the global Islamophobic war, she shudders, even as she frantically flips the pages of Now It's Come to Distances. From the essay on dictatorship of mortals to the one on ritual citizenship, separate pieces, yet born out of a continuous passage of thinking, and back to what is citizenship. So she was right in her initial suspicion. To speak as citizen in this conjuncture is to be on the side of the formal consensus dominated by majoritarian ideologies. This chimerical free Indian citizen who freely chooses to follow the Anushasan demanded by Sir's term, the PM of society, as her civic duty, is in herself the wet dream of this government of the communal majority. This was the scandal of Shaheen Bagh, that it fostered, within the same historical sequence as coronavirus, our auto-effective courage to declare, we the people, we the thinking people, are in excess over your obedient citizens. Reading, writing, Googling, and thinking under the benevolent guidance of the professor's words, now that she has decided to think beyond citizenship, the reader student revisits several social media fragments from early May 2020. According to several surveys, labor contractors, factories, and small companies across industries stopped paying wages as soon as the lockdown was imposed on 25th March. This meant the last time that lakhs of workers received a wage was at the end of February. They weren't paid for March. When on 1st May, the government opened special repatriation train services, nearly 10,000 migrant workers departed just the city of Bangalore in 4 days, in the first 4 days. After a meeting with the Confederation of Real Estate Developers Association of India on 5th May, the Karnataka government abruptly cancelled the remaining Shramik or labor trains. How long can we wait? Asked a daily wage worker who had exhausted his meager savings. All this talk of paying us more is nothing. All these companies are worried that once we leave, there will be no one to do their work. However, are they our responsibility? The reader student recalls another set of notes made also in another time of war. By 1863, Marx noted, the cotton mills of Lancashire were shut indefinitely. The American Civil War had disrupted their supply of raw cotton. Rapidly running out of the means to support themselves, scores of migrant mill workers petitioned the British government for aid. However, following a counter petition from the Manufacturers Association, the formal consensus, Marx calls it, quote unquote, the great public opinion, was that the migrant workers would be, and now I quote Sir and Marx together, shut up in the manufacturing districts in spite of their desire. You think walking was our first choice? The reader student recalls that the 2011 census counted 139 million migrant workers as the backbone of key sectors in urban India, such as construction, hotel, textile, manufacturing, transportation, services, domestic work. By 2019, the total number of those forced to earn a living as seasonal migrant labor, as a direct result of the country's economic growth policy choices, was set to cross 200 million. This data is from the Ajivika Bureau. Though, and they have taken the numbers from the 2011 census, and they've taken the 2017 economic survey projections and projected forward to 2019. Though on 29th March 2020, the Labour Ministry declared it illegal to withhold wages during the lockdown, no business owner was made to pay wages by force. Yet, all those migrant workers who demonstrated the free, self-reliant intelligence to march towards, and I quote a migrant worker, the hope of home, after weeks of waiting for the promised aid, were judged by the government of society to be on the wrong side, the side against which, as Marx wrote, wrong generally is perpetuated. Again, what global war was the Janta being prepared for? It is clear now. The intensification of what Sir calls a global civil war. A civil war whose regional rhetorical elision Modi effectively incarnates as the correct choice between past or present, 2002 or 2003, violent or vibrant Gujarat. The free Indian citizen had long accepted Indian politicians' rhetoric of an essential dualism between the superstitious masses and the productive classes. By the time the PM of society appeared for his fourth national pandemic address on the 13th of May 2020, it was evident that when he exhorted the Janta to Atmanirbharta, he did not mean the freedom to help oneself according to one's needs. He was deploying the language of self-sufficiency rather as a corporate code for, and I quote, Sir, a corporate code for the openness of one's own existence to serve the other's desire. Modi was reasserting what Professor Choudhury has elsewhere in his notes called the dogma of migrant existence as the historical and structural bedrock of contemporary society. A dogma that plays no small part in the cultic reception of the PM speeches and what Sir calls the risky power that he relishes. Now, thinking all of this stretches the reader-student's courage to the limit. And yet, in the benevolent light of the professor's decision not to accept coronavirus as a pure impasse, which would block even thought, and in solidarity with Vaibhav Abnave's incandescent preface to this book of passage, the reader-student declares, of course, there is the communal majority, its government's strategic engineering, and all the uncertainty the two imply, except that there is Shaheen Bagh, which is what? Which is the living memory that before we were infected by the mortal fear of coronavirus, we were also affected by the thought of justice, the thought of, as the professor reminds us, a generic humanity, which can only be the equality of all who exist in this country here and now. The conceptual world Professor Choudhury has resolutely extracted from the pitch darkness of this indefinite interregnum, the reader student understands now as a world between two decisions: the decision on equality, liberty, fraternity, and the decision not to speak as a citizen. This, she thinks, is what it means to say, we are a new constituent power. So, thank you.
Thank you, Shiraz. I mean, I did look at the clock a bit late, as in half a minute ago. A very warm presentation, I would say. And so far, all that I've heard is like everybody has come with a certain set of ideas written down, thoughtful, and yours was moving too. And I was also thinking of myself, like I began by saying, I wish I had been a student of Shomu. Someone is a student reader of Ambedkar and of this kind of thinking, which looks back, because the very title, Association and Isolation, the association is what Ambedkar and Other Immortals book was largely about. So thank you again, Shiraz, for sharing. I mean, when I think about all these presentations, I feel they should be shared somewhere for us to sit and take in a couple of more times, which I hope will happen. So now, the last response to the book from Sukriti Sharma. Hi, Sukriti. Can you hear us? Hello, Sukriti. Hi, can others hear me, or am I not audible?
Anand, we can hear you, but not Sukriti.
Okay, not Sukriti. Okay.
Not Sukriti. Yeah.
Maybe she is away from her laptop or something.
No, I can.
Oh, she's saying she'll join again. There should be some technical problem. I just saw her message on.
Anand, while this is happening, I'll join in 2 minutes. Yeah.
Sure. Any of you who wants a break, a bio break, or whatever it is? As I was thinking back to both what Shiraz said, something that Brahm earlier said occurred to me. It was this whole idea of, it's just not about being, it's about a certain kind of, it's not about coming, but it's also about a becoming that he was talking, a constant becoming. It took me back to one of my favorite passages in the Buddha and his Dhamma, where Dr. Ambedkar is, of course, trying to paraphrase Buddha in his own words, something which is called the doctrine of the Paticca Samuppada. So here he says, to realize that every being, every living being will die sometime or the other is a very easy matter to understand. But it is not quite so easy to understand how a human being can go on changing, becoming while he is alive. You know, that is the decision again, the decision that comes in the form of words for Ambedkar, where he says, I have decided to change. So from his earlier statement in 1935 saying, I will not die a Hindu, then the 1936 Annihilation of Caste address, to eventually the 1956 movement, where he is writing this, where he says, to end that quote, it is on account of sunyata that everything becomes possible. Without it, nothing in the world would be possible. It is on the impermanence of the nature of all things that the possibility of all other things depends. Sunya is like a point which is substance, but neither breadth nor length. So when you read this or go back to Bahya Sutta and such stuff, and I do get today, for me, it's such a wonderful thing as a publisher to listen to all these responses, simply because as a publisher, I also hear irate responses, people who are just not willing to read or engage with this and say, oh, what Shomo says is just like trying to be obscure. So everybody is trying to be obscure, is it? Is Ambedkar trying to be obscure? Is what is attributed to the Buddha steeped in obscurity? If you read the Bahya Sutta or if you read any of those things, it's a demand to engage in new modes of thinking, in rethinking how you think as such. So this evening's exercise for me was simply stimulating and energizing so far as we wait for Sukriti and Shomo to come back. Simply because it offers that it is not as if this is an opaque project, this project of thought, this research project, so to speak. Thank you, Shomo, for coming back. Is Sukriti now able to? Is she there? I'm just scrolling down to see. I don't think Sukriti has been able to join. Vaibhav, can you see her? Or what I suggest we do is we wait for her to
wait for her for a couple of minutes. I'm sure.
Couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm sure she'll be able to join. Her video was there. I mean, we could see her.
Now she is from the board on the right-hand side. Her name is not appearing. So till such time, Shomo, I was just trying to put my thoughts onto what this event has been. In your absence, I was just talking about the other kind of intolerance, which is a minority, which is of saying, how do we read this? How do we engage with this? This is also difficult, but it is not at all so, as this evening presentations illustrate for us. So I will let you weigh in, Shomo, as a response. And if we can... Vibhuti has just said, give us 5 minutes. So we'll use these 5 minutes by setting the ball rolling. I would like you to respond, Shomo, to what has been said so far. And we'll let Sukriti join us when she is ready. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, that sounds all right. I would have liked to wait for Sukriti, because I'm kind of hearing this as an extraordinary series of responses and the series of readings which honor me as a unity. I mean, though it's of course a whole. Thank you, Rakesh. It's a whole set of multiple ways of looking at these questions. Yet I am really experiencing this as a wonderful unity, to which Sukriti is, for the moment, last formal interlocutor. So
Sure.
So it's I would like to improvise or start something casual. So let me just, I mean, the intervening period, I mean, formally thank everyone.
Hello.
We shall do again after Sukriti.
Hello.
I think she is there now. There's Sukriti.
Yes, Sukriti is here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you and see you as well.
Okay. I'm extremely sorry. I've been there throughout the meeting, and just when I started speaking, the meeting kind of, I couldn't switch on my mic, etc.
Okay, that's fine.
But yeah, so thanks to Anand for inviting me for this discussion, and thanks to Prabuddha Collective, Navaina, and University at the Margins for holding this discussion. And I'm actually, traveling. I'm in Gujarat, and that's why maybe the network problems. And I just wanted to say that I'm actually really missing Delhi, being back there in Delhi, especially today, right now, because, whenever I've discussed this book or transcribed this book, it has always been in the company of my friends, Rakesh, Devjyoti, Akash, and Shomu sir himself. So today I'm speaking here alone, but I'm missing everyone back in Delhi. And I'm afraid that this may not be a new analysis, but I would like to present my reading. Madhuvanti, I couldn't understand what you
Yeah, she just asked you to lower the flap of your lap. You're fine. You're fine. We can see you properly now. Yeah.
Okay. So I would just like to present my understanding and my reading of the chapter, Shaheen Bagh, the first chapter. So, in the modern sense, the state is understood to be that which has the power to intervene in society. The site of intervention of the state becomes society. And the state survives every intervention. And it survives every intervention because it is an abstract entity. It is constituted by a distance from society, and something which is something like it's an abstraction, and hence because of its distance, its abstraction, it remains immune from any failure or success of the intervention. So hence Shomu sir in the book calls this the immortal abstract state. And so now with the coronavirus situation, what happens is that there is a crisis in the immortal image of this immune immortal state. There's a crisis in this image, and this immortal state now gets divided into what Sir says institutional immunity and historical fragility. So the institutional immunity of the state power, the police power, the medical power, and the historical fragility of the individual agents of the state, of medicine, doctors. So you kind of have this kind of a division within the immortal state of institutional immunity and historical fragility. And so with this crisis, this immortal state gets touched by mortality, which is what Sir says. So what happens is that why this becomes a crisis for the immortal state is because now this kind of this immortality and or this this abstraction gets exposed. And now from the immortal state, we move in this coronavirus situation, from the immortal state, we move to the dictatorship of mortals. So while earlier there was a distance or a division between the public persona and the private selves, the social space and the private space, this distance and this division gets collapsed. And hence there is a kind of an experience of mortality from within the immortal state. And I found this phrase, dictatorship of mortals, particularly interesting because Sir talks about the state as something that intervenes. And it is always dictatorship that intervenes. It is always dictatorship that decides. Democracy always discusses. So this is something that Carl Schmitt says in his book, Political Theology, that to decide or sovereignty essentially means dictatorship. And democracy can only discuss. Bourgeois democracy can only discuss. So now, we have a kind of a strange contradictory situation in the coronavirus situation, where the private self of the agent of the state has a sense of mortality within this immortal power of the state. So I found this dictatorship of the mortals a very interesting term. And what this dictatorship of the mortals tries to do in an emergency situation is, its task becomes to capture, to control living social bodies. So the task becomes the government of society. And this task to capture living social bodies cannot be done while remaining abstract. But it can only be done by socializing, which means by getting touched by mortality or getting touched by the infection itself. So this conversion to mortal governors of society is something Sir calls involuntary. So what does this government of society do through its intervention? It intervenes in an unequal, heterogeneous society, and it converts it into a single homogenized space. It tries to neutralize all differences and hierarchies. There is now one single enemy, the virus. And to neutralize antagonism is to eradicate politics itself. So the coronavirus situation and the state in the coronavirus situation tries to eradicate politics itself. So as Sir says in the book, now with this government of society, history is put in a containment zone, which means history is repressed. History with its hierarchies, its inequalities, its injustices is repressed. And what appears now is a violent consensus. This consensus says that there is only one enemy and there is only one war against this enemy, and all other antagonisms are repressed. And we know what is the nature of consensus, especially today's state which tries to achieve consensus means that it neutralizes all other differences. And this is a kind of an emergency strategy in the coronavirus situation, but this becomes a new strategy to kind of achieve a social power for the state. And this new social power of the state imitates the logic of caste society, because caste society also tries to achieve this kind of a frozen structure, this kind of a containment, where you have unequal castes, but the internal antagonism between these unequal castes is eradicated. And it is neutralized, say by disarming the lower caste, by pronouncing that the lower caste serves without resentment. So hence, all injustice and otherness in caste society is pushed onto one side. While war essentially means that war is between two equals who negate each other equally. So here in a caste society, this idea of a war is completely, eradicated. And this is the logic of caste society, which is also followed in the coronavirus situation by the state, by the government of society. Now, in this context, where the state intervenes to repress history and to repress politics, it is in this context that Shaheen Bagh is an intervention. And Shomusa says that it is Shaheen Bagh which is an intervention in this government of society. Shaheen Bagh is an intervention of history into the space. It is an intervention of history. The history now comes back out from that containment zone and enters the space of society. Hence, Shaheen Bagh is an intervention of politics. And politics, and what is politics? Politics is a struggle. It is a struggle to talk about the injustice. It is a thought of new life. And politics necessarily breaks all consensus. Politics is an intervention of a minority, and minority is always something that is understood in the sense of a deprivation, that minority is something that is not, something that is excluded. And it is this very minority that intervenes, and it proposes egalitarian principles. It proposes that an equal life is possible in a society which does not know equality. In an unequal society, a minority intervenes and says that an equal life is possible. And hence, politics is a kind of a weakening of state. And this is what I really like about the book, that this book is a political book because it tries to weaken the discourse of the state. And to weaken the discourse of the state is I think that is called politics. And hence, this is also something that Sir says, that Shaheen Bagh, for the exact name for which should be politics. So these were some of my thoughts on this chapter. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukriti. What we're talking about just now, how to kind of this whole effort by the state to kind of end politics, use coronavirus as an event to say, let's end politics, let's kick out Shaheen Bagh from 24th onwards, let's try to put a stop to things. And the idea which we began with through Soumick's presentation about social stupidity, and to think of the kind of obvious stupidity of what Trump and his supporters were trying to do, in contrast to the more sophisticated stupidity that you see that is on parade in India, where people have an greater acceptance level, at least in terms of the idea of democracy, the idea of this being, for instance, I was just thinking 2 days ago, there's a new science and technology policy that was put out 4 days ago, and because of the focus on the farm policy and its consequences, we are not really discussing that much. But Indian Express, which Shomo sir also reads often, has a column. It has a regular feature called Express Explains, Indian Express Explain. And this time, they had the person who authored the science and technology policy, some Akhilesh Gupta, who on his Twitter handle has Mahakumbh, his participation in a Mahakumbh conference as his image. This guy is the father of the science and technology policy, and he is allowed to explain it in a newspaper. The level to which journalism becomes an exercise in social stupidity. So with all this, over to Shomo has enough on his plate, enough morsels of thought put on this big thali, which is being offered. So over to you now, Shomo, to respond to all that has happened so far.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know whether I can actually, respond to these presentations. I mean, ideally, I would like to just just keep listening to more of you.
More,
and yeah. And not just for the lovely, the generous, wonderful things you say about me. Of course, one is very pleased, and one is always greedy for your good things. Why not? To hear about oneself. But not just for that reason, but for reasons of, the word that you people have been using, of course, citing me, which is thought. This really rich exposure of thinking in this kind of a digital reality, but still, as much as we can kind of live this together, it is a living moment. So it's this living kind of richness of thinking. So yeah, ideally, I would just like to hear more of you and more from you. But yes, of course, it is also something that I'm very happy to do, which is to talk to you a little bit, not too much. Though I don't know whether I can respond to you individually. I mean, you didn't really ask questions, though there were very profound, serious questions in everything that you said. But they're questions we share, they're questions we participate in. They are not really questions to me. To that extent, it's not like I can answer specific questions. And the other thing is that there's so many presentations and such a rich array of ideas that, and I, for physical, logistical reasons, I can't really make notes, though my book is about notes, but right now I can't really make notes. So I have not really been able to note down anything. So I'll have to speak both in terms of what I have been thinking, since I have put out this thing among all of you, and these concerns and things that are going on in my mind. So some of those general reflections, but also some of the things that occurred to me, many of the things that occurred to me as I heard you, but not in particular order. So it is going to be scattered, I'm afraid. So yeah, sorry for that in advance. So one of the things that I would like to say is that when I can't really reread the entire book. I mean, that would be unbearable for me. But when I go back to certain parts and reread, then some things that I notice, about what is there in the book. So one of the things that I have been, again, a word that has come quite frequently in your presentations, the inconsistency. So there's also the inconsistency that I have committed in the book while writing this. So, for instance, one of the things that I say in one part, I think one of the chapters, probably coronavirus notes, is that I wouldn't like to use too much metaphoric language. That is a language that is very, very common these days, which is the language born out of the situation, of the viral, the epidemic situation. So, for instance, we speak in terms of immunity a lot. sometimes, of course, in a more medical sense, but some biological medical sense, but often not necessarily in that sense. We speak of immunity in political, social senses, in existential, personal, connotations. And this is not the first time that we're doing that. There's a whole systematic thinking about through the language of immunity. Nevertheless, I do at a certain point, and I remember this because when I was kind of writing it out in wherever I was sitting and writing, I was quite conscious of this, that I wouldn't like to use the term, for instance, virus or immunity metaphorically, at least not much. But as I discover while rereading parts of the book, that I actually do use it a lot and use it in many senses. And well, it is metaphoric. So for instance, I speak about, well, contagion and viral in the context of caste. I speak about the question of the virus as part of this discussion about war. So there is an inconsistency on my part, but I'm also resisting this particular usage. At least I'm conscious of the usage as being as being something which is not entirely clear. I mean, it is not the meaning of these terms, which are not very transparent or univocal. Now, that is something which over the last months, or even after the notes were written down, and even the publication process was on, I have become more. I have been thinking about that more and more. So on the one hand, it seems that these, and in a way, this also comes out of what Soumick in the beginning was speaking about, the question of fact and norm and fact, and being on one side, and desire being something which sort of breaches that sort of positive solidity, So on the one hand, it should appear, common sense says that words like virus, the word virus should be clear. I mean, even if we cannot define it like a doctor or a biologist can scientifically, nevertheless, we would by and large agree that the virus is something which exists as a factual entity. Now, of course, there are some who actually question even the existence of the virus at some levels. I mean, factually, but maybe also at some other more complex structural level. That what does it mean to talk about the existence of the virus? Nevertheless, if one were to by and large accept that something like the virus must exist, and so the word virus should not be a problem, we discover as we go along in our discussions, whether it be in journalistic circuits, newspapers, media coverage, and even a little more well-reflective, specialized, but not totally specialized, but reflective social discussions, that the word virus actually starts to lose that kind of clarity, that kind of univocity or clarity of meaning. And then one suspects that it never had that kind of clarity of meaning. So while we read about the structure of the virus and its protein structure and its spiked form and all of those things, and it is something which more and more I am interested in, more now than I was. I mean, I was interested, but I had read very little when I was writing these notes, but now I have read a little more about these things. So while that is going on, the virus as a biological organismic sort of organism or organismic structure, while that is going on, at the same time, the meaning of the virus as something that we receive in our capacity as social beings, as subjects of society, is actually becomes far less clear and far more obscure to us more and more. So, for instance, one of the things that we see is that the question of the virus is posed in terms of something which is which is a kind of, which has a kind of intentionality. This has been there throughout, but sometimes it becomes that much more emphatic. So, in different uses of our references to the virus, we often see that the virus is as if presented as having some kind of a psyche, as some kind of a subjectivity itself. So this is something which I have noticed more and more, that the virus as if is a subject. Now, what does it mean to say subject? That it has a desire, or it has a structure of desire. It is moving through a structure of desire. And as in all desire, like Soumik so precisely and beautifully put it, that the object of desire is not transparent. It is problematic. So as if the virus itself is a subject with a desire. And the human being actually becomes a desire of the virus. The human being is not simply a biological entity then, and the virus itself is not another organism with a certain protein composition and stuff like that, but it is a subject in relation to another subject with an other. And this, between the virus and its other, that is a human other, there is as if a very complex, contested, and yes, a kind of warlike relationship. So that's why, of course, partly we understand this as common use of language, which, involuntary, just for the sake of conveying the intensity of what we want to say, we use a kind of language which animates inanimate things, or, we give a sort of human persona to non-human entities. So we speak of the virus as attacking us. But that is something which actually hasn't, even with the kind of factual objective status that the virus has got, particularly now with the vaccine on the horizon, that it's something the vaccine is going to deal with. But it has not lessened. It has, if anything, it has become more pronounced with time. The virus is a kind of consolidation of not just a subject, but a consolidation of a kind of enemy subject, a kind of subject which has a particular strategy. So then, not only does the virus have an intentionality, the virus also has a project. It has a strategy. Now, of course, partly even organisms can be seen to have strategies, insofar as strategies are meant to achieve an end. So organisms have, even in their specific biological constitutions, their organic compositions have a kind of strategy. So even survival is a kind of strategy. So if the virus has to survive to then enter the human cells, the receptor cells, then that is a kind of strategy. But I don't mean when we use it in language, this kind of animation of the virus, then we don't really mean it in the sense of an involuntary or organic strategy. We mean it in the serious sense, in the meaningful sense of the subject, even the philosophical sense of the subject, that as if the virus has a subject which makes it its identity. It's a subject in the serious sense. That subject is a kind of identity constituted by difference with the other. Now, that is very intriguing, because either it is only metaphoric and something that it's because we are not able to deal with the virus, we have to then translate it in our own terms, or there is something else going on, which is that the virus, or the so-called the factual thing called virus, is actually entering pre-existent circuits of our social and economic and civic lives. So the virus actually doesn't exist in the sense of something which is purely independent of our social, economic, and civic circuits of meaning. So when we speak of the virus as having an intention to enter the human world and destroy the human world as a kind of destroyer of world, the human world, that actually we don't mean it simply as an involuntary natural interruption. We mean it as subject in the serious sense, as being a kind of anti-subject, as a kind of enemy, a kind of, so it enters the civil circuit, then participate in the problems of society from within, which means a kind of civil conflict. It is participating in a kind of civil conflict. So it is a position, and the virus is not an entity, it becomes a position. And of course, like any position, it then allies with certain other positions and also separates and even tries to, annihilate certain other positions. So then the analytical question becomes at the level of society and the world, that what are the pre-existent positions and how do they circulate, how do they sort of ally and separate from each other in the world before the virus, and how does the virus in its so-called factual moment, historical factual moment of coming in March 2020 or whatever, February, December 2020, in its coming actually doesn't retain that kind of natural outsiderishness, but is always already signified or translated or re-inscribed in the earlier circuits. But of course, it intensifies those circuits, or if you were to think of the virus as a kind of unconscious tool of history, then it could probably be imagined to become a kind of tool or trigger of change. Change in the sense of the strong word of change, which is revolution or even emancipation. And this is something we have noticed from the very beginning of the kinds of responses of people from the world over. That either the virus has been seen as a particular trigger or a kind of, and in that sense we use the word event, because the word event again is not at all a clear word. Event can be many things, but it has been seen as an event simply in the sense of a natural trigger. Something which comes suddenly, but once it comes, it produces a series of cascading effects in the human world, social world, economic, civic world. The virus is a trigger like that. So either it is that trigger then makes us even more loyal towards the structure of our world, so that we have to somehow stave off the threat of the virus and the threat of this kind of disturbance, disorientation, to return to our world and to reconsolidate our world. Or we think in terms of a kind of revolutionary instrumentality and say, oh, the virus is an opportunity to change the world because we needed this change. And by and large, these two linguistic operations have continued up to the present, by and large. I, for my part, in my notes, though of course earlier I was very dimly aware of what was going on, and we were, of course, all of us thinking on our feet. That's a funny phrase to use, thinking on our feet, sitting down. But as time has passed, it seems to me that I do not quite subscribe to or accept any of these two ways of responding to this viral interruption. Like I said, not just in terms of the factual interruption, the biological factual interruption, but also this symbolic interruption, the very interruption of language itself by the virus. Neither do I think, and here I'm not alone, there have been people who have spoken to me about this, and I've read other people who I have really responded to. Neither do I quite accept that the virus is like an unconscious tool of history for change, nor do I think that the epidemic, the pandemic, is something which which must be seen as a challenge to be overcome so as to make our existent world even more, well, to again, to finally to succumb to the temptation of metaphor, or not the temptation, but the necessity of metaphor, the to make our world more immunized. So neither do I consider the question of the virus to be an immunitary question, nor do I consider it to be a kind of unconscious or natural tool of kind of immediate emancipatory or revolutionary, upsurge. Neither. In that sense, I don't think the framework or the form to think within which to think of the virus is a political form. That is the first move, or rather the first move not to make, which is to immediately politicize the virus. It is already politicized, no doubt about it, but not, in my view, again, a view which has been itself evolving, or not just evolving, but moving in a very unstable, wayward way over time. Nevertheless, this much I think I'm clear about, that not to simply go along with the politicized sort of intensity or the politicized connotations of the symbol or the sign, the word virus. It is already politicized, always politicized, no doubt about it. But in that sense, to actually make the other move, which is to make the move of knowledge. To make the move of knowledge. And I realized that when I wrote it, I myself was, because the Shaheen Bagh promise, or not the promise, but the Shaheen Bagh pre-world, a kind of pre-counter world, already there, always being there, which Vaibhav has put so shatteringly and so truly in and today Saket and Siraj and others have echoed that. The pre existence of a kind of post-COVID truths, or truths beyond COVID of Shaheen Bagh. Of course, I myself was entirely swept up by that, by that pre-existent kind of pre-existent futurity, a pre-existent what some philosophers have called future anteriority. Something will have been. So Shaheen Bagh will always have been, irrespective of whatever mortal devastation strikes us. So I was myself swept up by that. But while that is at one level absolutely the case, and nothing would have been possible without that force, still I would say that one of the primary efforts, and to that extent, Sukriti's last intervention today really was something which seemed to me to recognize that very well. I'm not saying others haven't recognized that, but Sukriti made it very explicit in a very precise reading of the first chapter, that there was a conscious effort to make the move of knowledge, even at the point when it was very clear that this knowledge is quite ineffective. This knowledge is not. I mean, nothing works. You see, that's the thing. This nothing of the state, political power, of the great political projects of what Soumick calls modernity, none of that works anymore. Absolutely. And that it does not work takes its toll on real people on the streets. And we, again, give it a great symbolic name, the migrant. And that name itself is not clear at all, univocal at all. It's not just a question of virus. None of our symbols are univocal, are clear. They become more and more difficult to hold on to. And yet we have to, use words at some level, and which we keep doing. So, So while this is a fact that nothing works, but even while nothing works, it is not as if there is a pure impasse. So I say in the very beginning of my preface that there is no pure impasse. The impasse itself is already contaminated. It is already a kind of it is impure. It is breached within its own consistency. There is no consistent impasse. So it is breached, of course, by politics, by Shaheen Bagh, by association, which have a certain kind of have a kind of living truths to them, even at their weakest, and particularly at their weakest. But also, even with the experience of the virus and with the state in question, with government in operation, the more things don't work, the more there are moves made. And those moves are also thinkable. Yes, of course, they are not thinkable in a universal terms. They're thinkable as tactical, as improvised, improvised modifications of existing assemblies, assemblages of power, and all of that. We know that. But the fact is, while those improvisations are taking place, we are encountering certain new modes of government. Of course, new modes of government, new modes of the use of power, but also new modes of government and the use of power, which are defined not by power, not by effectiveness or efficacy. Again, the word efficacy is interesting, and we could, have long discussions on each such word, because efficacy is another word which has come along with the vaccine, more and more, and yet that word is extremely rich in its ambiguity. So, government not in its efficacy, but government in the absence of efficacy. So the migrant effect was clearly a lack of efficacy. But a lack of efficacy does not mean emptiness. Lack of efficacy does not simply mean the void that, in a sense, we encounter in somewhat ambiguously comfortable circumstances of our little homes, inside, because it is ambiguous. Even this comfort of isolation, where you can be isolated, is extremely tyrannical and terrifying. But even more starkly, this inefficacy of government actually leads to what we've seen is literally, the abandonment of bodies to disaster. That does not mean that the government now returns with greater efficacious policies and moves. No, it doesn't work like that. What we've seen is, the more government works, the more we are faced with something which is the lack of government. So the word government itself divides between its so-called earlier, and Sukriti touched upon that very clearly, its so-called state, meaning its state agencies, its state institutions, and government, which actually becomes an expression of its continuous modification of bodies. But it is something which is happening from within society. You see, the ones who are moving the bodies of social bodies are themselves social bodies. And that becomes so naked, that becomes so violently exposed. And here, of course, I'm referring to doctors and also the police. Why not? That this kind of ineffective analysis is, I think, something which I try to carry out, or rather, analysis of wrong effects or miseffects of things that don't work, or they only work within very limited conditions. And I think it is important not to give up on that effort, even as we see that much of this effort to constitute knowledge and the discourse of knowledge doesn't result in anything that gives us any certainty. On the contrary. But it is very important to do so for the reason of what is called critique. Critique. What is critique? Critique is actually to expose ourselves to the limits of what we know. And not just what we know, but what we can do with what we know. But to explore those limits or to test those limits is something that I think in a situation like this becomes very, very important because if we don't do that, what we are doing essentially is to leave the question of knowledge entirely to the pre-existent apparatuses which are ideological apparatuses, of society. So even while government is, one of my analysis was that the migrant situation was brought about because, in a sense, the caste unconscious of Indian society was playing upon the government's mind from the Prime Minister onwards. It was something not playing upon in the sense of worry, but it was something which was activating their confidence that somewhere a society which is intrinsically so deeply hierarchical in terms of obedience to upper, the hierarchy of upper caste and upper zone people, you will be able to somehow put down a lot of people just on the basis of traditional hierarchical power and extract obedience from the population. But it didn't work at all. Within first 48 hours, it exploded. No one is going to obey this kind of madness. So that they were, they were now ready to enter into a zone of another madness, but at least a madness which was theirs. So to that extent, something which is where the government itself is seeing that its own ideological presuppositions, its received ideological instruments are not quite working. I don't see why, as part of public intellectuality, we should simply either leave knowledge to the older received static institutions of knowledge, which by and large are guarded by certain institutional forms, including the university, or entirely give up on knowledge such that we become, like I said, we become the involuntary creatures of a kind of apocalyptic hope that out of this apocalypse some tremendous change will come. So if we are not going to let either of these two things happen, then I think and that is what I was trying, we somehow must be able to try to think exactly at the level where thinking is the weakest. And in that sense, it is not a political project of thinking. It is actually the other thing. It is where politics is hardly visible. But of course, you can turn it around. And you can say, precisely because you want to think at the weakest, at the level of the weakest thinkability of what happens with policy, with what I've called government of society, basically, with a set of what is called protocols, standard operating procedures, where you keep repeating a set of protocols, where every time you repeat it, the results are probably turn out to be worse. But that does not mean you don't repeat them. So in that sense, the difference between knowledge and ritual becomes more and more fuzzy, indiscernible. Exactly the greatest emptying out of thought, hollowing out of thought. No thinking is left, and yet to be able to want to think at that level of thoughtlessness, or if you want, stupidity, is, I think, something which in Soumick's presentation it came out, is, I think, a philosophical desire, a desire of philosophy. But you see, it is not a desire of the philosopher in the sense of the institutional philosopher, the persona of the philosopher. And that's why in my interview with Huzaifa, I've said this. In my conversation with Huzaifa, I've said this, that of course, it is up to Anand and Alex and whoever's thinking of me with a certain generosity and affection to characterize me or anyone in a certain way or another way, philosopher or something else. And it's not a personal question of whether I think I'm competent or not. That is not the point. The point is, it is not a question of identifying oneself as this or that, philosopher or any kind of specialist, any kind of identity in terms of an institutional academic identity. It is exactly when such an identity becomes less and less defined, less and less mappable, that the desire for philosophy, or the desire which is philosophy, and that has come out through the presentations, all of you have said this, that it becomes that much more unavoidable. And this is something which has actually come out in very interesting, though very contested ways in the things that have been said by so-called well-known philosophical personi, philosophical personalities. Started with the Italian Agamben and went on to others and so on and so forth. But I think it would be a mistake to be drawn to the temptation of thinking of them as these personalities as attractors of philosophical thought, such that we read them and we kind of respond to them in our own heads, even if we are not writing directly about these things. I think we should look at it from the other way, that this is exactly the moment when they are also part of government of society. If philosophy is a kind of, and the word master has also been used today. And well, I don't know I tremble with that word. Nevertheless, to try and, speak about it a little bit. If the philosopher is some kind of a figure of the master, in the most general and yet in a very concrete sense, in the most precarious and exposed, and yet in a very real way, the master, then this is not even that kind of philosophical precarity of mastery and reality of mastery. This is where the philosopher is not a master, because the philosopher is, and many of these philosophers are old people, they're indeed social bodies, exposed bodies, in and to the situation. And it is at that level of the weakness of anything that is there to be thought, of a kind of surviving body, that the philosopher, or there is thinking, the desire of philosophy is something which circulates or is circulating. And so it doesn't come as the philosopher's thinking. It comes as the least thinking that is possible when the philosopher, Shakespeare thought of the philosopher as having a toothache. That no philosopher can bear a toothache. Even a philosopher can't bear a toothache. And here we are in the midst of a pandemic. And yet, thinking in the sense of desire. So their philosophy, so X person, Y person, Agamben, whoever else, depends on the name that jumps to your mind, but that is not the reason to read these things, that, the great philosopher has said. It's the other way around. It's because the philosopher at this moment is the least philosophical, or lives the least philosophical life, and has something to say, or is saying something, that we must test the desire of philosophy at the weakest, the general weakness of thinking. And yet, if at that weakest of the thinking threshold, there is some desire which still circulates, which still sort of gleams weakly, then yes, that weak gleam is worth warming ourselves with. Yes.
Shomo, if I may, there's a beautiful thought you. We are at about 7:25 now. Some people are leaving the discussion. So if I may ask you to kind of, this was a nice way to round up what is the job of philosophy. In fact, what you're saying is the philosopher is also at the weakest, the person who is doing the job of thinking, and at this threshold. So I wanted to know, Shomo, if you want to go on for a few more minutes, or should we? Other people who want to make some observations, other than those who were formally asked to, because a lot of names are new to me. So I would say there's something called raise a hand here. I have not moderated before, or I mean, not in this virtual assembly. So if somebody has something to put out in terms of either a comment or speak. What about Vaibhav, with whom we started, or anybody who hasn't had a chance, which are many. There are 34 people here, out of which say 7 or 8 of us have spoken. And Shomo, I was thinking as you were speaking about one thing, this whole idea of a virus as a subject and a subject with desire. And you went on to talk about, if I'm not wrong, how that subject is actually an anti-subject. I was also thinking of these ways in which, much before modernity comes to be in any sense, people have thought about the virus as an embodiment. In the Buddhist tantric thought, it is Harati, the goddess, and then it's Shitala, and many I would use the word Dalit Bahujan modes of thinking about smallpox or any of these epidemics as something that has a desire of its own and something to which you need to bow at some level as a being, if not as a body of desire. How do we reconcile that? And that probably still is one of the strands of thought at work. I'm not sure. I'm not a nativist or indigenist in any sense. I'm thinking of how, say, Ashish Nandi is not thinking about this situation, if I may give it a political spin.
Well, yeah, no, that's very interesting, because what you're saying is historically very correct, and surely there is a lot of reality to these modes of symbolical thinking in our present, and not just in India, all over the world. Surely different modes of symbolizing a natural crisis and a natural experience of something which is called virus only by a certain paradigm of science. That is very much there. But you see, what I'm
because we had one of the Supreme Court justices saying soon after saying, "Aise Mahamari aate jate hai," kind of thing. It's like as if it's a natural naturalization.
There is a common sense. There is a common sense. There is a common sense which works there, and there's also wisdom which comes along with it, in the sense of a kind of cyclicism. There's a cyclical rhythm of nature in our lives, where these things come and go. What I'm talking about is something slightly different. What I'm talking about is its role in government. This is my focus of thinking or analysis. What role does it have in government? Now, by and large, government works on a by and large a modernist paradigm, which is a scientific paradigm. You see, so the factual biological reference to the virus is very much the baseline, the reference point, and yet, in terms of its mobilization into strategy, into social action, this kind of animation, anthropological animation, is necessary. Partly, this works universally, that human beings need to subjectivize everything to be able to give it that kind of that kind of consistency in their discourse. Partly, but what I'm saying is, when this threshold becomes not just a metaphoric threshold, but it enters the very language of science itself. I mean, not science, but the positivist language, which is that of the state, which is that of official policy. Then things become quite contradictory. On the one hand, we refer to standard operating procedures of what to do as scientific prescriptions in the face of the virus. On the other hand, more and more we see that these standard operating procedures are immunitary performances rather than being any kind of immediately they cannot be correlated to any kind of governmental efficacy. Something which is not measurable in terms of immediate success, that it is not necessary that you can show to what extent the infection goes down by using a particular immunitary performance. Then they become part of a kind of ritual structure or ritual repetition. Now, the moment they become part of ritual repetition, they enter into precisely non-modern or pre-modern, if you want to periodize like that. In the Indian context, definitely caste structures, or caste unconsciousness. So this is what I am really talking about here. In general, you're completely right. In general, you're right. But that is not really what I was concerned with, either in my book or in what I was saying. Because you see, what I was saying was, that was the first part. But the other part to this is, given this kind of a threshold, what then becomes of? So I really like what Brahma Prakash did with again, a linguistic virtuosity he showed with the idea of coming and becoming, with the becoming political. With the coming of the distance is the becoming political, then to be entirely lost, to be entirely given up on. There is no becoming political. But of course, like Brahm points out, and he himself, contributes so much to that kind of vitalization. In reality, that is not true, because there are protests, and we can discuss the individual protests like you suggested, farmers' protest and so on and so forth. But there are protests, there are resistances, there are movements. When we did not expect anything, exactly 1 year after Shaheen Bagh, there is a different movement. Then it is not to be equated with Shaheen Bagh. There are specificities which we need to analyze, but that's a different discussion.
Shumo, Saket has a question about the word erotic and erotic shadow of isolation and such. I would like Saket to pose it himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, sir.
Hi, Saket. Yeah.
Hi, sir. So while discussing the last chapter,
yeah.
So the word erotic comes in different forms. So we wanted to actually ask you that if you can elaborate that there is a large sense of what erotic means, but it comes in different forms. Erotic shadow of isolation, the name of the chapter itself, subtitle. Erotic factor of time, or in the sixth subchapter of that chapter, digital classroom, politics and erotics.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So erotic is a kind of surplus. Erotic is the surplus of a subjective force, which is not entirely absorbed by the forms of our life, how we live our historical everyday lives. So I have taken two forms. One is the form of the relationship, the sexual relationship, and the other is the form of education, teaching. So Anu mentioned, and I really paid, I was surprised, but also I paid close attention to her students responding to the site of the education, and how it is not just because they're students doesn't mean everyone responds in the same way, because the very existence of the student is divided between being a student and being someone who is exposed, or in a family where there might be a crisis caused by the virus. There is a kind of vision among the student herself between these two things. So eros, or the erotic the erotic surplus is something which is tested for its maintenance in otherwise situations which apparently are reducible to something which is which is based on biological necessity or necessity of survival. So certain ordinary association would say that there cannot be anything erotic about the person in crisis, the migrant, the one who has fallen ill. There cannot be anything erotic about such a person. Now, whether that is true or not is something which can be verified individually. That's a different thing. But it depends on how you understand the phenomenon of eroticism. Now, and Anand, I remember, spoke about it very early on when I read a report in the Indian Express again. When you think of the migrant who is living in utterly, subhuman conditions and difficult, unbearable conditions of a camp where you're just about surviving, and yet if you are able to think in the absence of what you don't have and yet able to signify that absence, which is, for instance, the taste of food, the taste of something that you long for, and that longing, of course, then becomes by and large a cipher for eroticism in general. Then it is not clear, or it is not settled, that the migrant in a situation of utter precarity and at the very limits of her material life is not an erotic being. It is not It is not clear that you are not an erotic being, even at that limit. Now, of course, when it comes to the question of the biological isolation of the ill person, the stricken person, the infected person, there the question of eroticism becomes that much more difficult to sustain. And in a way, one would say that isolation, in the sense of the zone of biological isolation, the person who is infected and is completely isolated in the frozen ward, the hospital ward sense, is entirely cut off from eroticism, constitutively, but also socially. Because even eroticism requires a kind of zone, and all eroticism is a kind of spatial possibility. So in a completely isolated hospital ward, when you are infected, and this is something which we can only speak from at a distance, then probably the measure is not in any way, it's not erotically measurable anymore. That is true. But within these two limits, where the migrant is indeed, to me, a subjective desire and an impossible desire, but nevertheless desire, and this total biological isolation, I thought of these two social sides of the question of eroticism in the situation of the pandemic. One is the question of relationship, the erotic relationship or the love relationship, and the other is teaching. And I carried out the specific analysis, the way I thought best. But in both cases, we see equivocity, ambiguity. Why? Again, just to give the conclusion of those analysis, because in the love relationship, the very universality of love as a universal exposure to the other, is now totally closed off. Why? Because now love is already subservient to social, spatial segregation. Segregation within the family, segregation within your own residential zone, your own class, and of course your specific comfort zone, whether it be caste comfort zone or race comfort zone or any other kind of comfort zone. So love does not anymore be the very eventual condition of being exposed to the other, but it becomes only a function of your comfort zone. comfort zone in situations of segregation, of isolation, of distancing. So that's the first ambiguity. And the second is in teaching, and that's a more complex analysis. Teaching is something which, in its, and a lot of debate has arisen over it after Agamben's total repudiation of digital teaching. Because teaching happens in at least one mode in the presence of the other. That is the physical presence of the other, where presence itself is actually a very subtle experience. Presence is not the presence of the body of the other. Presence is the presence of the other as a locus of subjectivation, or locus of a kind of conversion, which I have called seduction. So in a digital mode, what are the conditions, possible conditions, if any, of such seduction? And if such seduction is to be entirely absented, there is no seduction, in that sense, no erotic condition of teaching, then in that sense, teaching becomes, and that's a very important question, does teaching become more, how should one put it, more not merely fair, but become less risky, less prone to the existent power relations that become the very material of seduction. The power relation of patriarchy, the power relation of the teacher-student, in any case, the institutional power relation, which again, institutionally, different spaces of modern institutions are trying to immunize themselves against by forbidding certain kinds of transgressive relationships within certain contexts. But anyway, that's a formal question. That's a legal question. In reality, with digital teaching, that is simply cancelled out. So in the absence of that kind of cancelling out, what happens to teaching, if it is not anymore this precarious, risky threshold of a transference or a kind of seduction which must be refused, a seduction which must be refused. So that complexity I tried to bring in as the two sides of an analysis of eroticism at the limits. Yes, Saket. Yeah.
Thank you.
So to ask others again, if there is anything any of you has to make as a comment, observation, question.
I wanted to ask a question. I don't know how to. I tried raising my hand. I don't know if it's working.
Oh, maybe I didn't notice. I mean, not that I saw any raised hand. So
Yeah,
this is
I'm tested
Chandni Mehta,
today.
right? Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
So now that you're on, please shoot the arrow.
Hi, Chandni.
Hi, sir.
Hi, good to meet you. Yeah, have you also.
Yeah, I have managed to read bits of your book so far.
Yeah.
It's in fact related to the previous question, and while reading the book also, I've been constantly trying to think about the relation between desire and thought, and also thinking as a kind of an intermediary process, or something that might mediate the relation between desire and thought. Because somehow through your writings, I'm constantly trying to understand what exactly are you trying to mean by thought. When you are talking about the migrants in particular, the kind of desire that seemed to be operating was one which you right now said, to return to a kind of a comfort space, and the constant waiting, people who said that we are, for how much longer can we wait, and which we've seen in the pandemic, the immediacy with which we want to go to find some space, however minimal or whatever, where there is some comfort. So there is the erotic there seems to be it was this very strange moment. It was in complete defiance to the curfew, to the lockdown, but at the same time it it almost seemed like all of that desire sort of went back home, And I remember you reading your piece before your book came, right at the beginning of the pandemic. You'd written about, uh, you know, uh, opening up spaces in the city for the migrants, and where one thinks of the desire in a way, moving in a sort of, it seemed to me like that you're seeing this intense surge of desire, and you seem to be caught between whether this is something making a claim on that basis, or what the migrant was left to do, which is to really return, which itself was, I mean, given that these are long journeys, so it's not a, I mean, I completely agree with you. One can't just simply talk about it in terms of despair. Eh,
Yeah.
But at the same time, would you want to make a distinction between, say, the desire that operated in Shaheen Bagh, or the kind that you wrote about for migrants opening up spaces in the city, or migrants claiming spaces in the city, um, and that of their return home? And to my mind, it's the former which lends itself to thinking more than
Yeah.
the latter. But I mean, that's just one way in which I was trying to think about thinking and thought. But if you can say a little bit more about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
relation between desire and thought, maybe
Yeah.
through these different instances.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Chandni. Thank you. So yes, I think there is a genuine ambiguity there. There is a genuine to and fro movement, and I agree with you that they both are not at the same level. The desire for something which is like, again, to use Brahms phrase, desire for something which is a becoming political is not the same as a kind of erotic surplus that you carry till the very last moment of your living life, till you live in any meaningful sense, which is longing, which is wanting to go back where you have some um, minimal sense of comfort, or you're drawn to, that yes, that is erotic in the sense of this a kind of anthropological surplus that you carry. As a human being, you carry the surplus of a memory, of a nativity, of bodies, of the eroticism, that kind of that passes between the body of the place where you grew up to the body of someone you love, in a way that actually is not distinguishable in terms of the experience of eroticism between the body of the lover and the body of a kind of native zone of one's life one has lived. And in that sense, the migrant wanting to go back to family, to love, to home, is something which is almost like an anthropological seed of surplus that you carry till that final threshold of a kind of isolation, which is another level of isolation. So that should not be collapsed or equated with something like desire, which is a desire for principle. So you're right. Thinking is what? Thinking is the thinking of new principles, but new principles which are not abstract principles in the air. Ambedkar would say airy. It is not an airy life of principles, but a principle which is becomes converted into kind of new dispositions. So indeed, you live a new life of fraternity and of love and a new erotic life, but it is activated not simply by something which is a relatively negative moment of loss, but activated by something affirmative, which is desire in the sense of encountering the impossible possibility of a new life. And when I spoke of the opening up of spaces in the moment of that very abandonment, then yes, I was trying to artificially claim a possibility of such an impossible possibility, which I also call leisure, the superiority of leisure over merely the principle of necessity, which is labor and work. So there is a kind of ambiguity which is there in the meaning of eroticism between these two, and they shouldn't be collapsed. I agree. At the same time, I don't think that the migrant's comfort zone is the same as the comfort zone which is the factual comfort zone of the upper classes. The factual comfort zone that if I come back to where I stay in Huskas, despite all the problems outside, and it was exactly like that in the early months of March and April, then I by and large feel very, very secure. Very, very secure. Within the four walls of my house, with by and large and so the analysis of services actually become extremely pertinent and essential to the question of not just eroticism, but the kind of infrastructure which even eroticism demands. So people can stay at home and live very, very beautiful erotic lives, but that is only possible when a certain infrastructure, a social living infrastructure is available to them. I don't think the migrant wants to go back or has any hopes or any, that is not, I mean, I'm only speculating, but let me still say that with some assertion. The migrant is not asking to go back to any kind of infrastructure, because there is hardly in a totally class-driven society any such infrastructure to look forward to. The village is not a place of comfort. It's not really a comfort zone. I don't even think it's a question of pure longing for something perpetually lost. It is a symbolization of something which is impossible today. So if I think and demand that give me some tadka in my dal, some spice in my food, then I am actually not asking my mother and my sister to come back to come to Delhi and do the chauk, the dal ka chauk for me, as a man used to women in the house doing these bringing these delectations to my tongue. No. That is only a measure. That is only by and large a conventional anthropological measure given to me by my life. But what I am really asking is the same thing that I put forward in my earlier article. When I ask for the dal, I ask it off the camp. I ask it here and now in Delhi, in Kejriwal's camps. To give me some taste. I want some taste. In the same way that I want some leisure in the Uber taxi. It's not different. Of course, I translate it within my own symbolic available and commemorative resources. So I think of family, I think of wife, I think of sister, I think of mother in the conventional patriarchal family as a migrant man. But the demand is here and now, which is not a demand which can be made without a material upsurge of what I've called a proletarization. So that's why the word migrant is very difficult to understand. It's, in my own linguistic confusions and to share those confusions with you, the word migrant is the most confused word to me. So in another thing that I've done, which we are not going to talk about today, I've asked this question, I've spoken this question aloud, that what is migration exactly? What exactly is migration? I don't think the answer is clear. And not to the migrant, particularly not to the migrant. So even on a train, I've said that I don't go back home on a train, I migrate home, which means it's circular. This kind of encirclement. The train is a figure of encirclement. And yet it is a circuit of desire in a very difficult way.
Shomo, we're nearing 8 o'clock now, so we should kind of. This is not a conclusive. Who was it who earlier said? Philosophers are here to ask questions and not actually give all the answers. And we have a lot more questions thrown up today because of this collective thinking, along with you thinking with us. So I would stop for one last question, if
just
it's all a short one.
For the last one, I'd like to just go back to Chandni and ask her whether this response is something that makes possible for her to think some more about this. Yeah.
Yeah, Shomu, it certainly helps. I remember even in Kerala, the government did a kind of survey when migrants were wanting to return, and they said that it's precisely the taste of the food. And it's not an empirical question really, but the migrants then were allowed to set up their were given provisions as per how they would want to cook, and
Right, right.
those recipes were shared, etc. So that they could have food in the way they would not otherwise
Right,
also were probably cooking but couldn't do in the pandemic situation.
right, right.
So I get what you're saying, but I'll have to think about it a little bit more, because in other lectures and even in your performance of Kafka's play long back, I remember this extremely beautiful moment when you're speaking to the academy, and you go and sit on a chair on one side of the stage, and you look back, as it were, into your past, and you remember
Yes,
somebody,
yes, yes,
and
yes, yes.
but then you turn away
Yeah,
and you sort of come back to your present.
right,
And
right.
that's
Yeah.
it's what you've said certainly helps in clearing a confusion, but I'll have to see
So
where it takes me,
that is a
because
fantastic memory. That is a fantastic reference, Chani. I'll just mention there because a lot of people might not know about the Kafka, so we won't go into that. Nevertheless, see, this is the difference between Kafka's story's character, the ape, because the ape has gone beyond that point. So for the
yeah,
ape, it is indeed
yeah,
something past.
yeah,
That erotic life of the body and a certain self is now, it's in the past. It is summarily in the past. And in that sense, it is a post-erotic life. And what is that post-erotic life for the ape? It is actually a life of performance, life of ritual, life of simply living in the public. What is erotic? Erotic is a kind of semi-private moment of publicity, no, with the other. The abandonment to the erotic solitude, which is a clamorous solitude with the other. That is not going to happen with the ape ever. Ever. The ape is openly inconsistent because he lives in a human world and he cannot ever have an erotic solitude. He lives an entirely consistently public life. He's only public. With the question of our situation, we are experiencing a human situation at the limit. So Jean-Luc Nancy has called it still too human. So all our human anthropological surpluses will be called upon to make this life livable, including the erotic surplus. But you are right to ask the question, is that erotic surplus going to be the resource for what is really at stake, which is change, which is a new life? No, no, no. In that sense, indeed, not to live a post-erotic life, but a new eroticism. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
thank you very much.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, if there are no further questions, Vaibhav, this has been a
Hi.
wonderful 3 hours. I'm sure many of you are.
Anand,
Who said
Praveen,
hi? Is that Alex?
Yeah,
Praveen
can you hear me?
has raised his hand already. Praveen.
Oh, okay.
Praveen has raised his hand, and there's Alex online right now. After Alex, let's have Praveen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
can hear
Absolutely.
you.
Hi, Alex. Good to
Yeah.
hear you. Yeah.
Hi, Shomo.
Yeah.
You were talking about a sort of banal politicization of the virus earlier.
Mhm.
So, in that regard, your term "government of society," can you talk about how that relates to a banal politicization of society itself? Like we generally say that society itself is political, but the term "government of society" it has a particular valence that you use. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks, Alex. So,
Can we also have Praveen's question
sure,
right away so that
Praveen,
we
yeah,
can have a
yeah.
final?
Yes, Praveen, yeah, yeah.
Praveen, are you ready to go? Praveen? Hi, Praveen, are you there? Okay, Shomo, then you go ahead with responding to
Maybe
Alex for
Praveen
that.
will, maybe he has a network problem. So
Sure.
yeah, he'll come back. Very briefly, Alex, this banal politicization of society is something which is also an overwhelming of social life by a certain politicization, which is basically an economic politicization. Sometimes it's also called biopolitics. We think of ourselves as constitutive of politics only insofar as politics is understood as a particular distribution of power, and power is based on productivity, contribution, eventually our own subjectivation as people who are part of the economy. We are circulating. So politics is a kind of circulation of power and value together in complex interrelations, of course. So that is a banal politicization of society that has taken place over a long time, I guess, 150 years at least. And that is the story of capitalism. And that's something which, in the government of society, of course, reaches a certain kind of a threshold of a particular kind of, it's a crisis. So the word that Ethno Balibar has used, all of us are using, is a crisis. So government of society is what? Government of society is when the doctor is someone who is now seen as an essential service, always seen as essential service. After all, doctors' professions are governed by ESMA and all of those laws. But now, not just legally, but existentially, ontologically. The doctor is, by being an essential servant or an essential server. Now, this is something else. This is a new threshold of a kind of intensification which becomes not banal, but non-banal, exceptional. So what is that exceptionality? It is the exceptionality of clearly a potential of martyrdom, death and martyrdom. This is what I've tried to analyze, as you know very well. But the trouble is the doctor still remains inserted, inseparable from the banal economy of being who, what? A worker, a contributor to the economy. The worker is providing any other productive service, like any other productive service. But now we are in a very strange fix. So that all the well-meaning channels of television and social media and so on, and all of us praise doctors, and rightly so, the sacrifices. Yeah, but the more you praise, the more you essentialize. The more you essentialize. So if you actually met a doctor who is on strike because he or she has not been, or the nursing staff who have not been paid a wage, then I bet 6 out of 10 those who praise the doctor in particular or the nurse in particular would say, oh, but they are meant to be essential servers or service providers. They cannot go on strike, which is the most brazen contradiction, absurd contradiction. The one who you have made exceptional, the exceptional, entity, ontological entity, has the least right to any
That's
kind
exactly, if I may say, what Gandhi says of manual scavengers or scavengers.
Exactly.
People. Exactly the echo of it.
Exactly. I use that structure in analysis. No, I said the doctor is in the middle. The manual scavenger is at the bottom of the martyrological the hierarchy. The top, the apex is occupied by the soldier, and in between is the doctor. Yeah, exactly. So in other words, we need a different understanding of the distribution between service and work. In that sense, we must re-banalize the politics, but re-banalize the politics not as a biopolitics, not as another layer to biopolitics, but actually, re-banalize politics in the strong meaning of not strong, but the more universal meaning of banal life, banal political life, as a life which is both universally lived, but also a life which has the potential capacity for universal thinking. In the way that I spoke of philosophy as truly concerned with banal life, which is a thinking life, a universal life.
Wow. I think that's it.
So if Praveen has come back, we can.
Is Praveen there? or was it an accidental touch of that raise hand thing? Because
Vaibhav, did you see Praveen?
No,
It is.
I actually, I've
You
not
probably
heard
don't.
from him.
You don't. No,
yeah,
fine.
so I think it's a nice way to end this conversation about the job of philosophy being to think about banal life, and now life at its kind of and is pushed to the extreme, to the margins as it is now. And the fact that this government would deal with the virus so callously as it promises to do with the vaccine, no questions, no politics around it, as we have been so clearly told. So, well, this book is going to have a resonance in terms of its effect. It's going to be much further than what exactly is about Shaheen Bagh and coronavirus as such. We didn't probably talk about everything that we still want to talk about. If there are no further questions, Vaibhav, should we?
Well, Vaibhav, you have.
Vaibhav, I would want Vaibhav to kind of.
You're a co-writer of the book, sir. Yeah.
Well, yes.
Yeah, independent.
Many scribes, but Vaibhav, that's why I also wrote the preface to the book.
Yeah.
If you have something to say, Vaibhav, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So in our collective rereading of the book, what struck me the most was the concluding section of the chapter Theatre and Plague and Impossible Europe, the name Europe, the way it returns there. And I was actually thinking about how this word connects theatre number event, Ambedkar and Other Immortals, and now it's come to distances in a very fascinating way, in a very complex way. The different resonances and echoes and resoundings of the word Europe, Europeanism. So I would in fact like to connect it to the two things which emerged during Sir's response today. The first is to think when it is at its weakest, and while responding to Chandani, new eroticism, that what we need is new, that the erotic surplus as it is may not lead to change. So I was thinking probably that the coinage Impossible Europe actually brings together these two things together, that to think when it is, and the desire for that which cannot be symbolized, which is possible desire. So somewhere I think Europe as a word oscillates between thinking at its weakest and the impossible desire which cannot be symbolized. So that is something which I thought I would share at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Vaibhav, for that formulation. It is very accurate, because when thought is met with its utter denudation of available symbolic discursive resources, that either there is a kind of collapse of thought back into, well, repetition or procedure. So we keep hearing the word procedure, standard operating procedure, follow orders, follow prescriptions, again and again, and all the instruments of communication, media, and so on and so forth are brought into force. So that is something we see. But the other is exactly the other direction at that crossroad is exactly the one that we hardly ever pay attention to, and yet that brings out all the possibilities, which is thought is too weak. I think I said this in my first book. Thought becomes too weak to capture. It is, what is weakness? Weakness is not simply the lack of thinking or something which is feeble thinking. Thought is weak in the sense that it is so light, it is so subtle, it is so much without the organs that thought carries in its usual consolidated use of form, that it cannot be quite captured anymore by available instruments of power, assemblages, systems and structures of power. So in that sense, yes, it is indeed it's moment of the impossible, and Europe is divided between these two. It's great consolidation of power, and at the same time, its exposure to the utterly escaping other. And that is another way of thinking about migration, which as a concept is unresolved. And more so, the more migration, the more the concept is unresolved. Almost like immunity. The more immunization, the less immunity. Again, not to be misunderstood, less immunity does not mean immunity is a fact which is now weak. The less the concept of immunity can be consolidated, or we know what is immunity. Similarly, the more migratory reality, the less we know what migration is. So, yeah.
Thank you again, Shomu. So, Vaibhav, since we do not seem to have further hands or questions, should we call?
Yeah.
Yes, Vaibhav.
So to connect to what Sir said, in fact, I thought a lot of the equivocations around these two words, erotic, and also in Chandani's question, desire. I mean, it's probably a question I'm putting forth to Sir, that do they come because the way these words are taught, they're taught within a certain dialectics of law and desire. But we are actually using, also simultaneously using these words outside, that indifferent to that dialectics, which is indifferent to the law and transgression. So precisely that's where the equivocation emerges, that we use it simultaneously in both these senses. Am I reading this right?
Yes, absolutely. So law and transgression produce, of course, law and transgression themselves are not so simple. Soumick already pointed this out in his presentation, that law and the question of law is more than the law. Law already has a surplus. Law has a kind of manifestation. That is erotic. Eroticism cannot be thought outside the law. Eroticism is transgressive, and yet that transgressive actually is an equivocal transgression, because is it only a breaking of the law, transgression of the law, is something in the law already transgressive. So you see, Catherine Malibu has said something really extraordinary. She said this contagion the question of contagion produces law, distance, but the very law produces contagion. The very law produces transgression. So in that sense, the surplus is not something that is going to be at the level of the structure so easily dispensed of through the opposition of law and transgression, or so ordinary dialectic of law and transgression. The surplus is always going to come and create a kind of equivocation or scrambling. The meaning of eroticism is not completely reducible to simply the question of law and transgression. So that is the first point. But what I'm trying to present is exactly along the lines he was suggesting, which is not exactly at this very rich and very sort of almost ungraspable idea of an anthropological eroticism beyond anthropology, which Malibu and George Bataille and such people have opened up. What I'm talking about is something a little more historical. So I speak of the impossible not as an anthropological impossible or in a general impossible, but historical impossible. The historical impossible. So the impossible is something which arises in history. So the farmers' protests have been mentioned. Brahm mentioned the farmers' protests, several times. So the farmers' protest is a kind of impossible. No, on the one hand, the farmers' protest is seen as something which is economistic. So the farmers' protest is relatively without controversy. Anand pointed this problem, pointed out this problem that with Shaheen Bagh there was already intrinsic to the demand there was a controversy, and with farmers' demands there is no controversy apparently. You can the government will not let in. They are going to play with those demands. They will not give up their their own state's interests and larger interests that they are promoting. But as such, the symbolic presentation of the demands is by and large non-controversial. Why? Because it is seen as economistic. There's an economistic rationale for this demand. But in that sense, there is nothing impossible about those demands. There's nothing impossible. But there was a real impossible, no? The historical impossible. What happened? One particular day, a poster was seen where the Bhima Koregaon arrests were protested. I mean, there was a protest slogan or asking for the freeing of those people, which became a moment impossible. It couldn't be symbolized within the so-called economistic terms in which people who might disagree with the demands would still sympathize with them. And of course, there was a class basis to this because it is led by rich farmers, partly rich farmers. It's all complicated. I don't want to get into that because I'm not competent to talk about it. But this much is clear that the farmers' demand as such is already given a symbolic economistic language, which both sides agree on. Now that was broken in the exact sense of the historical impossible, that this is not possible to look at this. So you immediately try and translate that in terms of transgression. Oh, these are anti-national. Oh, these are Khalistanis. Oh, these are some crypto Naxalites who have come in. But no. This is the real of the struggle because it is political and it is universal. So at that level, it is absolutely a public thinkable demand to demand from the state the end of its tyranny, end of its injustice, as a universal political desire, the desire of being a more of justice, as much for the farmer through its specific moment as for anyone else from their specific moment. See, I mean, I don't want to get into this, but even the idea of the minimum support price and all of that, at the economistic level, it's very complicated, very unsatisfactory, a lot of problems. But at the level of the idea of a minimum support price, it is an idea at the minimal level, an idea of a just price. It is not an economistic demand merely, it is a demand of justice, expressed in a problematic economic logic maybe. Yeah. So the impossible is exactly, the historical impossible is exactly the point from which a resymbolization has to be undertaken. So that is my point of departure, a concrete historical point of not any history, but the impossible. But of course, the anthropological sort of surplus, which eroticism, inexhaustible eroticism, is something which is fascinating in itself. Absolutely. But it is a different side of thinking, yes.
So it was nice that you loop back to this whole question of that was bothering me about the farmers thing, and you were kind of.
Shiraz has written that he has to ask for a small clarification. Shiraz?
Sure. Shiraz. So please, I didn't see that in the chat. Yeah. Oh, sure. Shiraz, go ahead.
Sure. So, Sir and Vaibhav, just connecting to the exchange you were that just passed. Is the impossible, like normally when we think of the impossible, it's something that cannot ever happen. But the historical impossible in that sense is something which cannot be symbolized, or is that what?
Yeah, the historical impossible is something that cannot be symbolized within our available language, within our available terms of thinking. That's all. So which is always specific to that particular form of experience that we're talking about. So again, going back to the farmer's experience, it is impossible to think of the farmer's experience as non-economistic, of course, within a particular framework. So the historical impossible is always with reference to a specific structure. Now, if you're not following that structure, then it is not impossible. But then we are referring to a specific dominant structure. So dominant structure of thinking about the farmer's agitation is an economistic structure. So within that economistic structure, to think of it as something which can have a public alliance at a universal political level, which by and large remains indifferent to the economistic logic, is impossible. You know. So yeah, absolutely. So this can be seen in the migrant experience. So if you think of the migrant experience as an erotic experience, that is an experience of something which asks for a pleasure, a specific surplus of pleasure in the concrete moment. So you can ask for the surplus of pleasure as a moment of dreaming, as an image. So you can say, look, the migrant has a secret life of dreaming. That is perfectly possible. So there are ways of governing. So eroticism is not a question of simply transgression and law. It's a question of government of eroticism. So you can govern eroticism through fictional means, through narrative. So Soumick pointed that out. You know, expressive media, narrativize it. So that is why so again, to go back to my own writing, the initial moment of my almost repulsion was to think of the migrant situation in terms of image. So the word migrant itself is a kind of image word. So even photographs, even, you know, newspaper so-called stories, at some essential level, in my heart, I resisted it. I still resist it.
Right.
Because the moment you do that, you as if make the experience into a form, but there is no form. It is a duration in the formlessness. You know, that's why the question of duration becomes so important. You know, so this is the reason why we have to think concretely in historical terms to then reach the threshold. So that's why what Sukriti pointed out becomes so important. You must analyze the government to reach its point of impasse. The impasse is not simply to be there. Even the impasse shouldn't be taken for granted. We have to insert the impasse into that movement which leads to that impasse. Which means, what is the government? So in that sense, you must also try to think from the side of the government. Absolutely. I mean, it is not for nothing that people like Slavoj Žižek say very openly that they are for lockdown. They say, of course, all the problems we know, and we know the terrible, but we are for lockdown. Strong lockdown, rigorous lockdown. I mean, why would they say that? Because it is necessary. I mean, whether you agree with Slavoj Žižek or not, but he is thinking, which is absolutely indispensable, to think from the side of where there is no thought, which is the state. In this, because the state is not the state anymore. The state is now in us, the government of society. So there is no other way. Yeah.
So
the state carries eroticism now. No, it's a terrible thing. There you are. Yeah.
So Chandni has raised a hand, and I think as a moderator, I'm going to take the call as that being the last raised hand question.
No, that's just a problem with the. Constantly.
So I think somebody just accidentally rubs their finger on that or something. That's.
Yeah, I'm trying to remove it, but it's not happening. Sorry.
Well, the touch. You know, the hand comes like this and shows me it's there. You know, so in this digital space. So I'm going to thank each one of you who has been present here. Those who have also left halfway through have been must be thanked. And I see this as something that is an ongoing conversation. This happened before the book, after the book. I see something like Prabuddha Collective, this whole idea of University of the Margins, as part of this ongoing conversation. It is something that we have all gathered around without necessarily knowing or meeting each other. And like Huzaifa pointed out, he wants to characterize this as subcontinental philosophy. I would also happily go with the idea of a new research project, and which is an ongoing one. And I'm sure we'll have more of these kind of discussions with hopefully more and more people coming on board. And I wish there was a forum, since all of you have got these kind of prepared accounts. If you were to revise it in the light of this conversation, please do. but we will probably get back, Vaibhav, if you don't mind, in terms of thinking about where to host these conversations around these book in the immediate future.
Yeah.
Because remember the Ambedkar and Gandhinagar initiative as well. So these are all part of these conversations. Some of us have been in it, some of us have not been in all these conversations in terms of being present. So I thank once again Vaibhav, Prabhuda Collective, and of course Shomo, Soumyabrata Choudhury. Thank you all.
No, you will not have the last word.
Oh, you will, is it?
I
Okay.
will, because I will thank you.
I told Vaibhav that this morning.
No, I will thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I will thank you. I have always said, Anand, Alex, both of them, readers, not readers and publishers, but readers, only readers. So anything else is really it's something that comes along as part
As a bonus.
of. Not a bonus. That's again an economic word, a financial word. But as something which is just a sort of which just follows. But the primary important thing is so I also thank through Anand all of you, because you really honor me by reading me. You really do, and I would really, and because I read you. And I read Anand, and I read some of you, and I read, and the honor is that much more pronounced that people who write and write so with such extraordinary felicity read me, and I'm honored and flattered. So thank you.
Well, bonus originally comes from bonum, which
bonum,
is
good. Oh, now let's not have Latin.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Let's leave the Latin for another day.
Thank you all again. Summum bonum. Huh? Okay. Bye. I don't know who closes this off formally, as in delinks this. I hope you all of you have a good evening. The rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, guys.
Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Shomu, once again.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah, congratulations.
now it's a bit late in the day. Yeah?
Late in the day.
It's a bit late in the day.
It's over.
No, it never gets over. No, it's just congratulations is something we can all accumulate within ourselves. Anyway, thanks everybody.
Thank you and bye-bye everybody.
Thanks everyone. रियाज आया क्या इसमें?
No, he was not there, sir.
He's not here, no? Yeah, I haven't spoken to him in some time. So yeah. So thanks, Vaibhav. Yeah. I mean, great. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
So
Rakesh, is he there? Rakesh or Debjo?
Rakesh, Deb, they are in the other room. They are in the other room. Yeah.
So Rakesh, when you put the recording off, would you also share the file then through Google Drive or something?
Yeah, tonight only.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
So ठीक है वैभव, मैं तो उठता हूँ फिर और हम लोग बात करते हैं, ठीक है?
Yes.
सब लोग बात करते हैं, जल्द ही बात करते हैं, ठीक है?
Yes. Thank you.
चलो, okay, bye.
Okay.